26 Navy SEALs, 230 enemy fighters, one canyon with no way out. The radios were dead. The ammunition was almost gone, and the walls of Black Ridge Valley were closing in like a fist around the men inside. Every tactical calculation said the same thing. They would not survive the night, but nobody had calculated for her. Lieutenant Maya Voss was already moving through the dark, already climbing the cliff that every military manual said was unclimbable, already positioning herself where no one thought to look. They had spent years ignoring her. That was the last mistake they ever made. If this story hits different, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because the next one, even more insane. You don't want to miss it. The mission brief had lasted 40 minutes. Maya Voss had spent 37 of them watching Commander Ethan Walker point at a terrain map that was already 3 years out of date. She sat in the back row of the mobile command tent, not by regulation, but by habit. The folding chair she'd claimed was wedged between a communications rack and a support strut, technically outside the semicircle of senior operators gathered around the central table. Nobody had asked her to move closer. Nobody had waved her in. She was there the same way background furniture was there. Present, acknowledged in the loosest sense, functionally ignored. The tent smelled like coffee gone cold and neoprene, and the particular kind of nervous sweat that men produce when they're trying very hard to appear calm. Walker had a good voice for briefings. Deep, steady, the kind of voice that made whatever he said sound like it had already been confirmed by 3 separate intelligence sources. He ran his finger along a blue line on the map, a narrow canyon system labeled Black Ridge Approach, and described the objective with the practiced confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in front of an audience. Reconnaissance insertion. 2-vehicle convoy hit along Route 7 confirmed enemy logistics activity in this grid sector. We go in, we document, we extract. 12 hours on the ground, maximum. No engagement unless initiated. Petty Officer First Class Danny Rourke, seated directly to Walker's left, nodded with the mechanical certainty of a man who agreed with everything the commander said before he finished saying it. Clean run. We've worked tighter terrain. The ridgelines bother me, Maya said. The tent didn't go quiet dramatically. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone knocks over a glass. A half-second pause before everyone decides how much attention to assign the incident. Walker looked up, not at her directly, at the general space she occupied. Go ahead, Lieutenant. The canyon approaches from the south and the north both funnel into the same choke point here. She didn't stand. She didn't walk to the map. She just pointed from where she was sitting, which she understood read as lazy to some people in the room and which she had long since stopped trying to fix. Whoever controls the ridgelines on either side controls everything inside. If someone wanted to trap a ground element in there, that's exactly where they'd position. We have air assets. Air assets take time to respond. If the radios go down, our comms don't go down. Our comms went down in Kandahar province in 2019 for 11 minutes. I was there. She let that sit for a second. 11 minutes is a long time when someone is trying to kill you. Rourke made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was designed to function like one. Shadow's worried about ghosts again. Shadow. The call sign had started as something neutral, she assumed. A reference to her specialty, her patience, her ability to disappear into terrain. But the way Rourke said it had shifted over the months into something else. A gentle diminishment. The ghost in the back row who sees things that aren't there. Walker studied the map for another moment. Then, noted, Lieutenant. We're moving forward, wheels up at 0200. She didn't argue. She never argued twice in the same briefing. Partly because she had learned that arguing twice accomplished nothing except making the person you were arguing with more committed to being wrong, and partly because she was already running a separate calculation in her head. If she was right about the ridgelines, and if the mission went sideways the way she thought it might, where would she need to be? She stayed in her chair until the tent emptied. Then she pulled out a worn topographic printout she'd requested from the intelligence section 2 days earlier and spread it across her knees. The cliff on the eastern edge of Black Ridge Valley was marked with a simple notation in red ink. Impassable. Vertical face. Unstable substrate. She studied it for a long time. Maya Voss had grown up in a town 40 miles outside Juneau, Alaska, where the nearest flat ground was a gas station parking lot, and winter started in October and sometimes didn't finish until May. Her father had worked seasonal fishing runs and spent the off months doing what Alaskan men of a certain type do with their off months, moving through the mountains with a rifle and a patience that looked to outsiders like a kind of spiritual practice. He'd brought her along starting when she was 6, not because he thought she'd be good at it, because her mother had left the previous winter and childcare options in a town of 400 people were limited, but she'd been good at it. Startlingly, almost inconveniently good. She could sit still longer than he could. She read wind shifts before he pointed them out. She found trails through rock faces that he'd have sworn had no trails. "You see the mountain different," he told her once, standing at the base of a basalt face outside Haines. "Most people look up and see what they can't do. You look up and see the route." She hadn't understood what he meant until she was older. The military had taken everything he'd built in her and refined it down to something precise and deadly. 4 years of specialized training, deployments across 3 continents, a confirmed record that she didn't discuss, and that her personnel file described in language so sanitized it bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. What the personnel file didn't describe was the other thing, the pattern that had followed her from unit to unit like a second shadow, the way she was consistently placed behind the primary element, the way her assessments were received politely and then set aside, the way men who'd been in the field half as long as she had spoke in briefings with 3 times her confidence and were listened to with proportionally more attention. She had brought it up once, formally, through the appropriate channels. The response had been sympathetic, thorough, and had changed absolutely nothing. So she had made a different kind of adjustment. She stopped spending energy on the argument she couldn't win and started spending it on the work. She was better prepared than anyone in every room she walked into. Her range cards were more detailed. Her observation logs were more precise. Her contingency planning was 3 layers deeper than what was required. Because if they were going to put her in the backup position, she was going to make the backup position the most dangerous place on the battlefield. The helicopters dropped them 4 kilometers from the canyon entrance at 0230. Cold had settled hard into the valley. The kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin but pushed through it, found the gaps in your gear, settled into your joints. Maya's breath came out in small white bursts as she moved with the team through a dry riverbed choked with loose rock and scrub brush. She was positioned at the rear of the formation. Rear observation element, her official role. It meant she watched the back trail for threats and provided overwatch when the primary element moved through open ground. It also meant she could see the ridgelines above them without craning her neck. She didn't like what she saw. "Voss?" The whisper came from the operator directly ahead of her, Petty Officer Second Class Torres. 23 years old, quiet in the professional way rather than the overlooked way. He was the only member of the team who consistently acknowledged her presence without making a performance of it. "You're slowing. Checking 6. Anything?" She looked up at the eastern ridge again, darkness, rock, the faint suggestion of wind moving through something that wasn't grass. "That's wrong." "Negative," she said. Because what she had wasn't evidence, it was a feeling, and feelings didn't transmit over team radio without getting you flagged as operationally unreliable. They entered the canyon at 0317 Babkinyasun. The first shot came at 0341. Not a warning shot, not a probe. A precision shot that hit Petty Officer First Class Garrett in the right shoulder and dropped him before anyone had time to register the sound of the rifle. The bullet had come from the North Ridge. Elevation advantage, distance probably 400 meters suppressor on the weapon because the crack had been muffled to something that almost blended with the canyon acoustics. "Contact north, Sut." Then the second shot, then the third, then something that was no longer sniper fire but full automatic, overlapping streams of it coming from both ridgelines simultaneously, and the world inside the canyon became a contained storm of muzzle flash and ricocheting stone and shouted coordinates that collapsed into each other because everyone was shouting at once. "North Ridge, multiple shooters. Medic, Garrett is down. Move to the wall. Move to the—" Walker's voice cut through. "Element, break left. Get to the rock formation. Suppressing fire." Maya was already flat against the canyon wall, putting stone at her back, scope up and scanning. She could see the muzzle signatures on the northern ridge, 3, 4, 5 distinct positions, overlapping fields of fire designed to cover every angle of the canyon floor. Her mind was doing the geometry automatically. Elevation advantage for them, zero elevation advantage for the SEALs, and the canyon walls that should have provided cover were instead channeling the fire like a funnel. She keyed her radio. "Walker, this is Voss. Both ridges are hot. Minimum 8 positions north, unknown south. They knew exactly where we were going." "Copy, Voss. We need an exit route." "The south entrance is blocked. I can see movement on the ridge. They're repositioning to close the gap." She scanned again. "We're in a box." Static for 2 seconds. Then, "Copy that. We hold the rock formation and wait for air support. ETA on air support. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. She did the math against the ammunition count she'd observed during the patrol movement, the rate of fire she was hearing, the number of bodies she could count moving on the ridge lines. The math didn't come out right. "Walker, we won't have 40 minutes. No response. She wasn't surprised. Said. Torres materialized out of the darkness beside her, pressed against the same rock face, rifle up. His face was cut along the jaw from rock debris, not serious but bleeding freely enough to look worse than it was. "How bad?" she asked without looking at him. "Garrett's hit in the shoulder, probably won't lose the arm. Hutchins took a ricochet off his vest, cracked ribs, walking. Reyes is..." A pause. "Reyes took one in the thigh, femoral might be nicked." That changed the math worse. "Anyone have eyes on what's behind us?" "Negative. South end is dark." "It's not dark. They're staging there." She looked at the wall above her. Then she looked northeast toward the part of the canyon where the cliff face rose almost vertically above the ridgeline. "Torres." "Yeah." "You remember the terrain briefing from 2 days ago? The eastern cliff? The one marked impassable?" "Look at it." He looked. A long pause. That's a straight vertical face. Most of it. There's a crack system running up the northeast corner. See it? Where the rock color changes? Another pause. Longer. "You're not serious." "From the top of that cliff, you have a direct line of sight to every enemy position on both ridges. Elevation advantage, angle of fire, full coverage of the canyon floor." She was already unbuckling her pack as she spoke. "That's the only position that saves them." Maya. He almost never used her first name. "That climb would take, even in daylight, without gear, that would take an experienced technical climber an hour minimum. It's pitch dark. You've got combat load. The rocks are loose." "I know." "If you fall..." "I know." He stared at her for a second that felt longer than it was. "What do you need from me?" "Radio discipline. Don't announce my movement. If Walker asks where I am, tell him I'm repositioning for better observation angle." She finished stripping her pack down to the essentials. 400 rounds of .338 Lapua, 2 liters of water, the rifle, 1 trauma kit. Everything else she left against the rock. "And when the shots start coming from up there, make sure they hold their position. Don't let them break cover and run at the extraction point before I've cleared the ridge lines." Torres grabbed her arm as she turned. Not hard, just enough to stop her for 1 second. "Come back down," he said. She looked at him. "That's the plan." Then she was moving. The base of the cliff was 60 meters from the rock formation where the SEALs were pinned. 60 meters of open ground that had at least 2 enemy observers covering it. She moved during a sustained exchange of fire when the visual environment was bright with muzzle flash, and everyone's night vision was blown out. Flat on the ground, elbows and knees, the way she'd learned to move before she learned to walk upright in combat. She made the cliff base without being seen. Up close, the rock face was worse than it had looked through the scope. The crack system she'd identified from below was real, but it was narrower than she'd estimated. Barely wide enough for 3 fingers in most places, and the rock surrounding it was the crumbling, flaking type that gave way unexpectedly under pressure. The cliff wasn't a single clean face. It was a series of broken ledges and overhangs, some of them false. They looked solid from below and went to nothing when you put weight on them. She started climbing. The cold worked against her immediately. Her fingers were already stiff from the ambient temperature, and the rock was colder than the air. It pulled heat out of her hands through her gloves, which she'd thinned down to maintain tactile sensitivity. She could feel every edge and grain of the stone, which she needed. She could also feel them trying to take her skin. 40 feet up, a hold she'd committed to crumbled. Her right hand lost purchase entirely, and she swung out on her left. The weight of the rifle across her back shifting her balance, and for one completely clear moment, she looked straight down at the canyon floor and understood exactly what falling from here would mean. Don't. She found the wall with her right hand again, reset her feet, breathed. Below, the gunfire was a continuous roar now. She could hear grenades detonating. Theirs or the enemy's, she couldn't tell from this angle. She could hear voices, but the words were lost in the acoustic distortion of the canyon. She kept climbing. 80 feet, 100. The crack system widened briefly around what felt like an old fault line, and she moved faster through that section, trusting the deeper holds, trying to make up time she could feel leaking away with every minute the seals stayed on the canyon floor. At 130 feet, an overhang forced her sideways for 8 meters along a ledge that was barely the width of her boots, hands flat against the rock above her, moving in a traverse she would have described as terrifying if she'd been narrating it to someone instead of just doing it. The wind hit her hard when she cleared the overhang. Up here, exposed to the valley drafts, it was a different animal than the still cold of the canyon floor. It pushed at her in unpredictable gusts that tried to peel her off the wall. She tucked into a chimney in the rock, waited for a lull, then moved again. 160 feet, 180. Her left hand was bleeding inside the glove. She could feel the warmth of it, which on a night this cold was almost welcome. A sharp edge had caught her palm sometime in the last 20 feet, and she hadn't stopped to check it because stopping wasn't an option. 200 feet, the top was there. She pulled herself over the edge and lay flat on the summit plateau for exactly 5 seconds. Enough time to inventory her body, to check that nothing had broken without her noticing, to drag in 2 deep breaths and feel her hands shake with the particular tremor that comes after sustained physical fear rather than during it. Then she rolled into position behind a rock formation near the summit edge and brought the rifle up. The canyon unfolded below her like a tactical diagram come to life. She could see everything. Enemy sniper, northeast ridge. A machine gun emplacement 100 meters east. 2 commanders standing behind a rock outcrop, one of them with a radio handset directing the assault on the canyon floor. An RPG team repositioning along the south rim, a flanking element trying to work its way down the western slope toward the SEALs' position. They had no idea she was here. She would have about 90 seconds before they did. Maya pressed her cheek against the stock. She found her breathing. She let the crosshairs settle. Below, the radio handset crackled in her earpiece. She could hear Walker's voice, ragged with the particular strain of a man who had run all his options and come up empty. Requesting immediate air support. We cannot hold this position. I say again, we cannot hold. The Eastern Ridge sniper shifted his barrel toward the rock formation where the SEALs were sheltering. He was settling in for a precise shot on someone inside that position who couldn't see him coming. Maya's finger was already on the trigger. The scope went still. The wind paused for 1/2 second between gusts. She fired. The shot crossed 260 meters of dark air and hit the Eastern Ridge sniper before the sound reached him. He dropped without a word. His rifle clattered off the rock ledge and disappeared into the darkness below. For exactly 1 second, the battlefield didn't know what had happened. Then Maya was already moving the scope. The commander with the radio handset was mid-sentence when the second shot took him. He folded sideways, the handset falling from his grip and bouncing off the rock. And the man beside him spun around looking for the threat in completely the wrong direction. South, toward where his own flanking element was moving, as if the shot had come from there. She fired again before he finished turning, 2 down in 4 seconds. The machine gun emplacement was her next target, not the crew, but the weapon itself. She put a round through the feed tray cover at the point where it met the receiver. The gun seized. The crew went flat behind their position, trying to figure out whether they'd been shot at or had experienced a mechanical failure. By the time they figured it out, she'd moved to the RPG team on the south rim. 3 of them. Spaced badly. They'd spread out to cover ground, but hadn't considered that spreading out made each one individually exposed. The first went down before the second understood there was a threat. The second was moving when she caught him mid-stride. The third made it behind a boulder and stayed there. She let him stay. Below, something was changing. Commander Ethan Walker heard it before he understood it. The machine gun that had been chewing through the rock formation to his left went silent. Not a reload pause. Silent. Then the RPG team that had been repositioning on the south rim went silent. Then the second sniper who'd been forcing his team to keep their heads down stopped firing. "What the?" Rourke started. "Shut up," Walker said. He pressed himself against the rock and scanned the ridge lines. The fire was still coming. The general assault hadn't stopped. But the precision elements, the things that had been systematically taking apart his team's ability to move, were going quiet one by one. "Someone's working the ridges," Torres said from his position 3 meters away. Walker looked at him. "Our air support isn't here yet." "No, sir, it's not." "Then who?" A shot rang out from somewhere high above them. Not from either ridgeline, but from above the ridgelines, from the cliff face that his pre-mission brief had categorically described as impassable. An enemy squad leader who'd been shouting coordinates from an exposed position on the north ridge crumpled and went down. Walker looked up at the cliff. In the darkness, he couldn't see anything. No muzzle flash. She was managing her position well, using the rock formation to disperse the signature. No movement, nothing. "That's the eastern cliff," Rourke said. He sounded like a man who had just been told something he'd rather not believe. Nobody can climb that. That's a vertical face." "Somebody did," Torres said. His voice was flat. "Careful." Walker keyed his radio. "Voss, this is Walker." "Voss, report." Static. Then, very quiet and very controlled, her voice. "Little busy right now, Commander." Another shot from above. An enemy radio operator who'd been trying to re-establish contact with his command element went down 30 meters from Walker's position. Walker stared up at the cliff for a long moment. "Torres." His voice had changed. Something in it had recalibrated. "Where did she go when the contact started?" Torres was quiet for a beat too long. "Repositioning, sir. Better observation angle." Maya had maybe 40 seconds before they found her. The enemy was good. She'd known they would be. The precision of the initial ambush, the overlapping fields of fire, the way they'd positioned to close every exit told her these weren't irregular fighters working off instinct. They were trained, disciplined, and when their key elements started going down from an impossible angle, they wouldn't spend long being confused about it. She was already tracking the adjustment when she saw the first fighter look up. He was on the north ridge, 210 meters out, and he turned his face toward the eastern cliff with the specific stillness of a man who had just solved a problem. He raised his hand and pointed. She watched him point. "There it is." She put the crosshairs on him. Then she stopped. "If I take that shot, every head on this ridgeline turns up here in the next 10 seconds. I lose the element of surprise. I have maybe 8 to 12 high-value targets left before the extraction window. If I spend the next 2 minutes being hunted instead of hunting, some of those targets live, and some of those targets are the ones pointing rockets at the helicopters." She let him point. She moved the scope instead, fast, disciplined, prioritizing. Heavy weapons first. There were 2 remaining RPG-capable positions she hadn't cleared. Then the remaining squad leaders. Then the communications elements. She had a list in her head. She worked it. The second RPG position went down. The shooter had been in the process of shouldering his weapon and turning it toward the rock formation below it. He never completed the motion. The man beside him grabbed the launcher, and Maya put the next round through the launcher itself, turning it into scrap and sending both men scrambling backward off the ridgeline to find cover they suddenly didn't have. A squad leader on the south rim was shouting orders in a language she didn't speak, but whose cadence she recognized as command authority, the particular rhythm of someone directing other people toward a specific goal. She interrupted him. North Ridge, second to last position, a team of 3 who'd been laying down suppressing fire on the canyon floor. She fired twice in rapid succession, and the suppressing fire stopped. Below, she heard something shift. The gunfire coming from the ridgelines had thinned to maybe 40% of what it had been 5 minutes ago. She could hear the SEALs return fire now. Not just defensive, but purposeful. They were finding targets, they were moving, and then the eastern cliff started shaking. Not literally, but in her peripheral vision, Movement registered at the cliff base. 3 figures, moving fast, starting to climb. She'd known this was coming. She just hadn't known how fast. Took it. The 3 men climbing toward her were not amateurs. She could tell by the way they moved, not fighting the rock face but reading it, trusting their hands, conserving energy. Whoever had sent people who knew what they were doing. They were also 60 meters below her and moving fast. Maya made a decision. She had 2 targets left on her ridgeline priority list. She worked them both in the next 90 seconds, accepting that she was slightly rushing her positions and that a rushed shot at this range and in these conditions carried real risk of missing. The first shot was clean. The second hit wide by 4 inches, and she adjusted and fired again, which cost her time she didn't have. Then she came off the rifle and started moving laterally along the summit plateau. The clifftop wasn't a flat surface. It was a broken terrain of boulders, shallow depressions, and wind-scoured rock formations, maybe 30 meters of usable width before the western edge dropped back down into the ridgeline the enemy controlled. She moved east along the summit, away from her firing position, putting distance and 2 large boulders between herself and the point where the climbers would crest. She found a secondary position, not as clean a line of sight into the canyon, but workable, and settled in. The canyon below was changing. She could see Walker's element beginning to consolidate near the south end of the rock formation. Someone had made a decision to consolidate rather than hold spread. Correct call, the right response to the reduced pressure from the ridgelines. A casualty was being moved. She could see the distinctive awkward movement of 2 operators carrying a third. Reyes! She found her breathing again. Come on. She went back to work. There was a machine gun position she'd missed on her initial survey, concealed behind a rock formation on the north ridge, only visible now because the operator had shifted his field of fire in response to the team consolidation below. She put 2 rounds into the position before the gun got aimed properly, and the position went quiet. An observer who'd been calling coordinates into a radio, she could see the radio handset, could see the precise controlled movement of a man who believed he was well concealed, ceased to be an observer. The south ridgeline was nearly clear. The north ridgeline still had 4 or 5 active positions, but they were no longer coordinated. Without the command structure she'd dismantled in the first 4 minutes, they were individual fighters making individual decisions, and individual decisions without coordination created gaps. The SEALs below were finding those gaps. Walker? Voss? She kept her voice flat, professional, the same register she used when she was calling range distances back at Pendleton. South Ridge is clear, North Ridge is degraded, approximately 4 to 5 active positions, no command coordination observed. You have a window. A pause. Longer than it should have been. Then, copy Voss, confirm your position. Summit, Eastern Cliff. The pause this time was different. She couldn't see his face, but she'd been in enough radio conversations with enough commanders to read the texture of their silences, and this one had something in it she hadn't heard from Walker before. Understood, he said. Voss, we have climbers on your position. 3 tangos ascending the eastern face. I know. Can you set? I'm handling it. Keep your element moving south. Get to the extraction point. I'll cover your movement. Voss. A beat. Don't do anything stupid. She almost smiled. Not in my nature, sir. She clicked off and shifted back to covering the canyon floor. The first climber crested the summit edge 11 minutes after she'd spotted them at the base. 11 minutes was fast. Genuinely fast. She'd taken 23 minutes in the dark with a combat load and a bleeding hand, and these men had done it in 11 with presumably lighter equipment but also without the foreknowledge of the route that she'd acquired on the way up. She heard him before she saw him, the scrape of boots on rock, the grunt of a final pull, the small sounds of a body coming over a ledge. She was behind a boulder 8 meters from where he crested. He came up with his weapon already moving, sweeping right, then left, finding the firing position she'd abandoned and the empty space around it. He went still. Clear, he said quietly, speaking to the men below him. She waited until the second man was halfway over the edge. She didn't use the rifle. Not up here, not at 8 meters in the dark. A rifle was a precision instrument, and this was not a precision situation. She came around the boulder fast, using the rock as cover until the last possible moment, and the first man had approximately 1 second to register the movement before she was inside his reach, and the situation became something different from a firefight. It was brief and ugly, and she took a strike across the left side of her face that she didn't fully avoid, and then it was over, and the first man was not going to be a problem, and she was behind the boulder again, and the second man was fully over the edge and bringing his weapon up. She put 2 rounds into him from the pistol she'd drawn and moved before the third man cleared the summit. The third man was smarter than the other two, or more frightened. He cleared the summit low and fast and immediately went behind cover, a different rock formation from the one she was using, which meant they were now sharing a 30-meter plateau and neither of them could see the other. Silence. Wind. Somewhere below, she heard helicopters, distant, but there. The deep rhythmic percussion of rotor blades working against thin mountain air, coming from the northwest, which was the right direction. Air support. She had to keep the third climber pinned long enough for the extraction to complete. If he got back to the edge of the summit and had a line of sight to the canyon below, he had a line of sight to the helicopters. "You don't want to do this," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It wasn't tactical. Nothing came back from the darkness across the plateau. The helicopters were getting louder. She shifted position, moving silently around the long way, using 3 separate boulders as intermediate cover, trying to get an angle on his position without exposing herself to it. The cold was deeper now. Her hands were having trouble with fine motor tasks, which was a problem because fine motor tasks were what kept her alive up here. She found a gap between 2 rocks and looked through it. He was there. 15 meters, pressed against a boulder, facing the wrong direction. He was watching the space she'd last been in, not the space she was in now. She had a clean shot. She took it. And then there was only the wind and the sound of helicopters growing louder and the distant but unmistakable sound drifting up from the canyon below of men who had been certain they were going to die, discovering that they were not. Maya sat down against the boulder, just for a moment. Her left hand had stopped bleeding or had bled enough that it felt that way. Her face ached along the cheekbone where she'd taken the strike. The cold had worked its way into places she'd stopped noticing during the climb, because noticing them would have been a distraction. And now that she could notice them, she noticed all of them at once. She brought the rifle back up and scanned the ridgelines below. 2 active positions on the north ridge, 1 on the south. She worked them methodically, without rushing, the way her father had taught her to work a distant hillside. But patience, breath, trigger break. The helicopters were in the canyon now. She could hear the changes in rotor pitch as they descended, the way the sound bounced and multiplied between the canyon walls. Her radio crackled. "Torres, first element is on board, wounded aboard. We have 8 out." She kept scanning. 12 out. A muzzle flash on the north ridge. Someone had repositioned and was firing at the helicopters. She found the position, adjusted for the elevation and the wind that had shifted in the last 10 minutes, and fired. The muzzle flash stopped. 19 out. Walker's element is moving. She kept the scope on the canyon floor, kept the crosshairs moving, kept finding the threats before they could complete what they were trying to do. 23. 24. Her ammunition was running low. She did a fast mental count. 12 rounds remaining. She needed to spend them correctly. 25. Walker is... Stand by. A burst of static. Then, 26. All elements aboard. Voss, we are at full count. I say again, full count. She put the rifle down. For a moment, she just breathed. Then she picked it up again because she wasn't down from the cliff yet, and the cliff didn't care how tired she was. The descent took longer than the climb. Coming down was always harder. Gravity was helpful in one sense and murderous in another, and the holds that had worked on the way up were in the wrong orientation for the way down. Her left hand had stiffened enough to make gripping painful, and she stopped twice to rest it against the rock and wait for the ache to subside enough to continue. At 60 feet from the base, a hold she'd trusted on the way up gave way. She dropped 4 feet before her right hand caught a crack in the rock face. Caught it wrong, fingers going in sideways, and the wrench of it went up through her wrist and elbow in a way that made her see white for a second. She hung there, not moving, waiting for the white to clear. Don't. The white cleared. She finished the descent. At the base of the cliff, she sat on the ground for 30 seconds before she trusted her legs enough to stand. Then she walked south toward the extraction point. The helicopters had set down in a flat area 2 kilometers from the canyon entrance. By the time Maya walked out of the darkness into the ring of light from the aircraft's running lights, the medical team was already working on 2 of the wounded, and the rest of the team was clustered in the exhausted, purposeless way that men cluster when the immediate danger has just ended and nobody's told them what to do next. She walked past the outer perimeter, past a pair of operators who looked at her and then looked at each other, past the medical station where someone was working on Reyes with practiced urgency. Torres found her before she'd gone 20 steps past the perimeter. He looked at her face, at her hand, at the rifle still slung across her back. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite any single identifiable emotion. Relief and anger and something that might have been close to awe, but not the comfortable kind. "You're bleeding," he said. "I know." There's blood on your face and your hand." "I know, Torres." He stared at her for another second. Then he grabbed her left arm gently, the way you'd handle something you were afraid might break if you weren't careful, and steered her toward the medical station. They passed Commander Walker on the way. He was standing at the edge of the light, facing the direction of Black Ridge Valley, the way men sometimes stand when something has just happened that they need a moment to put a frame around. He heard them coming and turned. He looked at her. Not at the space she occupied, not at the general vicinity. At her. She stopped. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Garrett is going to keep the arm," Walker said finally. "Reyes is going to need surgery, but they're calling it manageable." He paused. 26. We got all 26 out." "Good," she said. Another pause. The cliff was marked impassable. The notation was based on a daylight technical survey by someone who wasn't looking for a route, she said. They were looking for reasons not to. Different question. Walker looked at her for a long time, long enough that she had time to wonder what he was finding when he looked. "You told me the ridgelines were wrong," he said. "In the brief?" "Yes." "I didn't listen." She didn't offer him anything on that. It wasn't the moment for comfort or absolution, and he wasn't asking for either. He was just naming a true thing. "Who taught you to climb like that?" he said finally. She thought about her father, about a basalt face outside Haines in October, the smell of cold rock and spruce, the way he'd said you see the mountain different. "Someone who knew the mountains," she said. Walker nodded once. Something in his face had changed from what it had been in that briefing tent. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have described precisely, but changed. "Get that hand looked at, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir." She walked to the medical station. Behind her, she heard Walker say something to Torres, too quiet to make out over the rotor noise. Torres's response was equally quiet. She didn't try to hear it. She sat down on the equipment case the medic pointed her to and let them look at her hand, and for the first time since she'd started climbing the cliff, she allowed herself to feel something other than the next problem. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter than both of those things. It was the particular piece of a person who had been told, for a very long time, what they were incapable of, and had climbed the wall anyway. Somewhere north of Black Ridge Valley, the canyon lay empty and still under a sky beginning to show the first gray suggestion of dawn. The rock formations where 26 men had waited to die stood silent in the cold. Shell casings on the stone, scorch marks on the canyon walls, the particular stillness of a place where something significant has just finished happening. On the eastern cliff, above the tree line, the summit plateau was just as empty. But on the rock face, if you knew where to look, and almost nobody did, there were marks. Handhold marks. Boot scuffs. The scored trail of someone's ascent through the impossible dark. Evidence that someone had been there. Evidence that the impassable had been passed. The wind came through and moved across the cliff face, cold and indifferent, and the marks stayed where they were. Dawn was coming. To everyone watching this, wherever you are in the world, remember this. The people who are told they are invisible are sometimes the only ones who can reach the places nobody else can. The quietest voice in the room might be the one that saves everyone in it. And the wall that everyone says cannot be climbed? Sometimes it just needs someone who is angry enough, patient enough, and desperate enough to try. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where this story landed, and if it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The medic's name was Kowalski, and he worked on her hand with the focused silence of someone who had learned that asking operators how they felt about their injuries was a waste of everyone's time. Maya sat on the equipment case and let him work. The running lights of the helicopters cast everything in a flat, cold white that made people look like versions of themselves rather than the actual thing. Around her, the team was coming down from the operational high in their various ways. Some men went quiet, some went loud, some found something mechanical to do with their hands. Rourke was running a functions check on his rifle for what Maya estimated was the third time. Torres was sitting on the ground with his back against a wheel strut, not doing anything at all. Kowalski irrigated the palm wound with something that stung sharply, and she didn't move. "This needs stitches," he said. Later. "Lieutenant, when we're back at base." She looked at her hand, at the clean, deep cut across the meat of her palm where the rock had opened it. "Wrap it. I'll deal with it when we land." He wrapped it without further argument. The bandage was tight and professional, and she flexed her fingers against it twice to test the restriction. Across the landing zone, Walker was on a satellite phone, standing with his back to the team. She could read his posture, the slight forward lean, the hand not holding the phone pressed flat against his thigh, and knew he was talking to someone above his pay grade. The call had started 2 minutes after the last helicopter touched down. She wondered what he was saying about her. Then she decided it didn't matter and went back to watching Kowalski finish the wrap. The flight back to the forward operating base took 40 minutes. Maya sat against the helicopter's portside bulkhead with the rifle across her knees and her wrapped hand resting on top of it. The noise inside the aircraft made conversation impossible without headsets, which suited her. The men around her were either unconscious with exhaustion or staring at the middle distance with the particular vacant expression that followed sustained combat. The brain's way of processing what it hadn't had time to process while it was happening. Reyes was in the second aircraft with the medics. She'd heard them say femoral intact before they loaded him, which was the information that mattered. Garrett was 2 seats to her left, his right shoulder immobilized, his face the gray-white color of a man running on adrenaline fumes with nothing left in the tank. He caught her looking at him and held it for a second. Then he nodded. Just that. A nod. She returned it. It wasn't much. But from Garrett, who had spent the better part of 6 months treating her the same way furniture treats the people who walk past it, it was something. She turned back to the window and watched the mountains go dark below them. FOB Kestrel was a collection of prefabricated structures and hardened containers arranged inside a perimeter wall of HESCO barriers, positioned on a plateau that the wind had decided to treat as a personal project. It was always cold at Kestrel. The heating systems worked intermittently. The coffee was bad. The intelligence section occupied a building that had previously been a vehicle maintenance bay and still smelled like it. They landed at 0521. By 0600, Maya had stitches in her palm, a fresh wrap, 2 Motrin, and orders to report to the intelligence section at 0800 for an after-action debrief. She spent the intervening time sitting on her bunk in the female accommodation container, which she shared with 2 female support staff who were not currently present, and cleaning the rifle in the methodical way she always cleaned it after a deployment, which was to say completely and without shortcuts regardless of how tired she was. It was a habit she'd picked up early and kept, because rifles that weren't cleaned properly killed the people who carried them at the worst possible moments. Her hand made the process slower than usual. She adapted. Outside, she could hear the base coming alive in the early morning way. Vehicles moving, a generator cycling up, the distant voices of the day shift beginning whatever the day shift began. Normal sounds, the sounds of a place where the emergency had happened somewhere else. She broke the bolt carrier group down to its components and lined them up on the cleaning mat. She thought about the briefing that morning, the dismissal, the condescension wrapped in the reasonable-sounding language of operational protocol. She thought about Rourke's laugh. Then she thought about the cliff. Then she stopped thinking about either of those things and focused on the rifle. Bam. The intelligence section smelled like old paper and electronics, and the aggressive air freshener that someone had deployed in a losing battle against both. Lieutenant Colonel Diane Marsh ran it, A compact woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that processed information with the visible efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a very long time. Marsh had been at Kestrel for 3 months. In that time, Maya had spoken with her directly 4 times, twice in formal briefings and twice in passing, and each time had come away with the impression of a person who was considerably more attentive than she appeared. The debrief room had a table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard, and a wall screen currently displaying a satellite image of Black Ridge Valley from an angle that made the canyon's geometry brutally clear. Looking at it now, Maya could see the trap even more precisely than she'd been able to from inside it. The overlapping fields of fire, the choke points, the staging areas where the assault force had positioned before the SEALs entered. Walker was already there. So was Rourke, seated to Walker's left in what was apparently his default position in every room. 2 intelligence analysts flanked Marsh at the far end of the table. Maya took a chair on the opposite side from Rourke. Marsh opened without preamble. Let's establish a timeline. Commander Walker, you called contact at 0341. Lieutenant Voss, your radio traffic shows you reporting to Walker at approximately 0347. What was your position at 0347? Approximately 40 feet up the eastern cliff face. A silence. One of the analysts, young, with the look of someone who had graduated recently and was still recalibrating his expectations of what field personnel were capable of, looked up from his notes. The cliff marked impassable, yes. How? There's a crack system in the northeast corner. It's not visible in the standard survey photographs because the survey was conducted at midday in summer and the shadow orientation hides it. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her breast pocket and put it on the table. The topographic printout she'd had in the briefing tent 2 days earlier. I identified it from this. The substrate in the crack system is more stable than the surrounding face. It's climbable. Marsh picked up the printout and studied it. Her expression didn't change. You identified this before the mission, she said. Yes. And you climbed it in darkness, under fire, with a combat load, with... She looked at the bandaged hand. What happened to the hand? Rock edge. Somewhere around the 130-foot mark. You finished the climb with a lacerated hand. It wasn't bleeding that fast. Marsh set the printout down carefully. The way she set it down suggested she was choosing her next words with equal care. Rourke cut in before she got there. With respect, Colonel, the tactical question here isn't how Lieutenant Voss got up the cliff. It's why she was in a position to need to. He looked at Maya with the expression of a man raising a reasonable concern. Standard rear observation protocol doesn't include independent movement to alternate firing positions without command authorization. Lieutenant Voss left her assigned position without reporting her movement to the element leader. I reported to Torres, Maya said. Torres is a PO2. He's not the element leader. The element leader's radio traffic at that point was running at approximately 1 transmission every 4 seconds. I made a judgment call about what constituted an appropriate time to interrupt. A judgment call? Rourke let that sit for a moment. That's an interesting way to describe breaking formation protocol in a contact situation. Walker, who had been quiet until now, said, Rourke. Just the name. Just what to once. Rourke leaned back. His expression didn't change, but he stopped talking. Marsh looked at Walker. Commander, in your assessment, was the Lieutenant Voss's movement tactically justified? Walker was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that Maya recognized as a man choosing truth over comfort. Yes, he said. Another silence. Different texture than the first one. The element would not have survived to extraction without the suppression she provided from the summit, Walker said. The air support arrived with 7 minutes to spare on the extraction. Without her... He stopped. Started again. The math doesn't work without her. Rourke's jaw moved slightly. Not quite a clench. Something in that direction. That's a generous reading of a protocol violation, he said. That's an accurate reading of what happened, Walker said. His voice was still even. It had a quality Maya had not heard in it before. Not anger, but the particular flatness of a man who has decided to be precise. Write it however you want in your section of the AAR, Danny. That's what I saw. The room was quiet. Marsh made a note on her pad. Lieutenant Voss, Walk me through your target priority sequence from the summit. The debrief lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. At the end of it, Marsh asked everyone except Maya to step out. The analysts gathered their materials and left. Rourke left last, and the particular way he moved toward the door, unhurried, deliberate, not looking at Maya, communicated something she filed away without examining immediately. Walker paused at the door. He looked back at her once, briefly, and then followed the others out. Marsh waited until the door closed. Then she looked at Maya for a moment with the expression of someone who is organizing several things at once. The preliminary enemy assessment puts the force size at between 210 and 240 fighters, she said. Coordinated insertion, pre-positioned on both ridges, communications infrastructure in place before the SEAL element entered the canyon. This wasn't an opportunistic ambush. Someone planned this with advanced knowledge of the route. Maya had understood this since 0341, but had not said it aloud in the presence of the full debrief group because saying it in that context required her to also say what it implied, and what it implied was a very specific kind of problem. Someone told them we were coming, she said. That's one possibility. Marsh's voice was neutral in the way that suggested she had moved past the possibility stage. The route selection was finalized 36 hours before insertion. In that 36-hour window, 8 personnel had access to the full operational plan. Maya looked at her. I'm telling you this, Marsh said, because you're the only person in that room this morning who flagged the ridgelines before we went in. I reviewed the pre-mission documentation. Walker's brief noted my concern. Walker's brief noted that a concern was raised and addressed. It didn't note who raised it. Marsh leaned back slightly. I found out who raised it by pulling the tent recording. The intelligence section recorded all operational briefs. Maya had known this. Most people forgot it. I'm not telling you this so you can do anything with it, Marsh continued. I'm telling you because your instinct about that terrain was correct, and that instinct came from somewhere, and I'd like to understand where. Maya looked at the satellite image on the wall screen. The canyon, the ridgelines, the cliff. I grew up reading terrain, she said. Mountains specifically. I've been doing it since I was 6 years old. That's the short version. That's the relevant version. Marsh studied her for a moment. Your personnel file has some gaps in it. Maya didn't respond to that. Not unusual gaps, specific ones, the kind that appear when someone's operational record has been classified above standard access level. Marsh paused. I have standard access level. Then you've seen what's available. I've seen what's available. She picked up her pen and tapped it once against the table. I've also worked in this building long enough to know what those gaps usually mean. Maya looked at her steadily. Is there something you want to ask me directly, Colonel? Marsh considered that. Not today, she said finally. You've had a long night. Get some sleep. We'll talk again. Maya stood. Lieutenant? Marsh's voice stopped her at the door. You climbed an impassable cliff in the dark with a bleeding hand and saved 26 people. Then you walked into a debrief and sat through 40 minutes of a subordinate officer implying you broke protocol without losing your composure or raising your voice. A pause. That's either very good discipline or a very practiced skill. Maya looked at her. Both, she said. She walked out. The base at midday was a different place than the base at 0600. The temperature had climbed to something almost bearable. The vehicle pool was active, supply runs coming and going through the main gate. A group of operators from a different unit were running PT laps around the interior perimeter. The kind of men who ran PT the morning after a mission because stopping felt worse than moving. Maya walked back to her accommodation container without hurrying. She was halfway there when Rourke fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. They walked for 20 meters before he spoke. Hell of a night, he said. His voice was conversational, friendly almost. Yes. 26 out. Clean extraction. Nobody's going to argue with that result. No. The how is a different conversation. He kept his eyes forward, hands loose at his sides. You know how this reads in an official report, right? You abandoned your assigned position in a contact situation. You moved independently without command authorization. You escalated your own role without being tasked to do so. I saved their lives. You did. He didn't disagree. That was the particular thing about Rourke. He didn't lie directly. Nobody's going to dispute that. But we have protocols for a reason, Voss. You can't just decide in the middle of a firefight that you know better than the element structure. She stopped walking. He stopped a half second later and turned to face her. What is this? She said. A conversation. What kind? He looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding how honest to be. She'd seen that expression before, on people who were about to tell a truth that served their interests while leaving out the part that didn't. The kind where I tell you that what happened last night is going to get complicated, he said. There are people up the chain who are not going to be comfortable with the way this goes into the record. A junior officer leaving her position without authorization, making independent tactical decisions in a combat situation, making correct ones, making ones that worked out. He was patient, almost kind-sounding. These things don't always work out, Voss. And when they don't, what looks like initiative looks like something else. She looked at him. She let herself really look, not at the surface of the conversation, but at what was underneath it, what he wanted and why he wanted it now, walking next to her at midday, friendly and reasonable. You're trying to get ahead of something, she said. He blinked. I'm trying to give you... You're not. Her voice stayed level. You're figuring out which version of last night is most useful to you, and you want to know if I'm going to be a problem. She held his gaze. Am I? A pause that went on just long enough to confirm that she'd named the thing correctly. You should get some rest, he said. His voice had changed, not much, but the friendly warmth had gone thin at the edges. Long night. He walked away. She watched him go. Sleep came in pieces and left the same way. She was under for 90 minutes, then awake staring at the container ceiling while the heating unit ran its cycle. She got up and drank water and checked her hand. The stitches were holding. The swelling had started to build, which Kowalski had told her it would. She lay back down. The conversation with Marsh circled in her head. Your personnel file has some gaps in it. She had not been surprised by that. She was surprised that Marsh had said it aloud, in that particular way, with that particular implication. Most people who encountered those gaps in her file either didn't know what they meant or pretended they hadn't noticed. Marsh had done neither. Maya had served in 3 units before this assignment. The first 2 were standard-issue postings, the kind that showed up clean in any personnel review. Deployments, performance ratings, the normal accumulation of a military career proceeding on its expected track. The third was different, and the record of it was different. And what had happened during those 19 months was not something she had discussed with anyone at this base, including Walker, including Torres, including anyone. She had a reason for that. The reason was that the work she'd done in those 19 months was the kind of work that didn't get discussed, and the skills she'd built doing it were the kind that made people uncomfortable when they understood what they were looking at. She closed her eyes. The cliff was there when she closed them. Not the terror of it. She'd processed that during the descent, filed it in the category of things that were over, but the geometry of it, the specific texture of the crack system under her fingers, the way the wind had tried to take her and failed. She fell back under. Torres found her at 1600 in the equipment room, re-rigging her pack with the stripped-down load configuration she'd used for the climb. He looked at what she was doing. He looked at her hand. He sat down on a gear case without being invited. Marsh pull you in this morning? He said. Yes. Rourke? She glanced at him. You saw that. I was coming out of the chow hall. He picked up a carabiner from the table, turned it in his hands, set it down. He give you the protocol speech? Variation of it. He's been talking to people. Torres said it without editorial, the way he said most things. I don't know who, but he's been on the satellite phone twice since we landed, and both times he moved away from people first. She kept working. I'm not telling you this to make you paranoid, he said. I know. I'm telling you because... He stopped, started differently. You saved my life last night. You saved all of our lives. And I've been in long enough to know that the way things should work and the way things actually work are not always the same, and I don't want to see you... He stopped again. She looked up at him. You've been in what, 9 years? She said. 10. Then you know that being right doesn't protect you. He looked at her. Yeah. So what do you want me to do with what you just told me? He was quiet for a moment. The equipment room was loud with the ambient noise of the base, generators, vehicles, a distant metallic hammering from the maintenance section. In that noise, his quiet was its own kind of answer. Nothing stupid, he said finally. Not in my nature. He almost smiled. Not quite. You said that to Walker this morning. It was true then, too. He stood up. At the door, he stopped without turning around. Reyes is out of surgery. They're calling it a full recovery. A pause. He asked who the sniper on the cliff was, the one covering the extraction. She waited. I told him your name, Torres said. He didn't know it. He left. She sat with that for a moment, the specific weight of being unknown to the people whose lives you'd just saved. It wasn't a new feeling. She had a longer relationship with it than most. Then she went back to rigging the pack. At 1800, she was summoned back to the intelligence section. Marsh was alone this time. The debrief room had been rearranged. The wall screen was showing a different image now, not Black Ridge Valley, but a wider regional map, and there were red markers on it that hadn't been there that morning. Sit down, Marsh said. Maya sat. The enemy force composition from last night is being reassessed. Marsh stood at the wall screen, not pointing at anything specific, just looking at it. The commanders you neutralized have been partially identified through communications intercepts. 2 of them are connected to a network we've been tracking for 14 months. She paused. A network that has been feeding on route intelligence from coalition sources. Maya looked at the map, at the red markers, at the particular geographic pattern they made. How many operations, she said. In this region, 4 confirmed, possibly 2 more pending confirmation. Marsh turned from the screen. Last night would have been 5. The number settled in the room. The source of the leaks is unknown, Marsh said. The investigation is ongoing and is being managed above my level. I am not part of that investigation. She looked at Maya steadily. What I am is the intelligence officer at this FOB and one of the 8 people with access to last night's operational plan. Maya heard what she was saying. You're clearing yourself, Maya said. I'm being transparent about my position. Marsh picked up a folder from the table and held it. I'm also going to tell you something that I shouldn't tell you, and I'm telling you because I think you're going to need to know it, and because I believe you're capable of handling it without doing something that makes the situation worse. Maya waited. Marsh opened the folder and put a single printed document on the table facing Maya. It was a communication record. Timestamp, sender ID, recipient code, and a text string that was mostly redacted. Black bars through most of it, but with one phrase visible in the middle, subject identified as threat to operation. The timestamp was 0214, the night of the mission, 2 hours before the insertion. Maya looked at it. Threat to operation, she said. Yes. That's not a standard enemy communication format. No, Marsh said. It's not. The room was very quiet. The sender ID is still being traced, Marsh said. The recipient code routes to an external server. The analysis is ongoing. She picked the document back up and returned it to the folder. But I want you to understand something, Lieutenant. Whatever happened on that cliff last night, whatever you did up there, somebody, somewhere, considered you enough of a threat that they flagged you specifically before the mission started. Maya looked at the wall screen, at the red markers, at the geography of 14 months of coordinated disaster. Subject identified as threat to operation. Not the SEALs. Not Walker. Not the mission itself. Her. Why would they flag me? She said. Her voice was steady. She was making it steady. Marsh looked at her with the expression she'd had that morning, the organized one, the one processing multiple things simultaneously. That, she said, is what I'd very much like to know. Maya sat with it for 11 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. An old habit from the kind of work that required you to know exactly how long you'd been still, how long a target had been stationary, how long silence had been going on before it became something other than silence. 11 seconds was how long it took her to move the information from the part of her brain that received it to the part that knew what to do with it. Subject identified as threat to operation. Timestamp 0214. 2 hours before insertion, before the SEALs were in the canyon, before the contact, before any of it. Someone had known she was going to be there and had considered her presence a problem worth flagging to whoever was on the other end of that redacted recipient code. Not Walker, not the mission. Her. "How did they know my name?" she said. Marsh had been watching her process. "That's the question." The operational roster for last night listed me as rear observation element. It's not a prominent role. Someone would have had to specifically look for me in the team composition. Maya kept her eyes on the wall map, on the red markers. That means either they had access to the full personnel breakdown, or they already knew I was attached to this unit and were watching for my name specifically. "Both of those are concerning in different ways," Marsh said. "The second one is worse." She looked at Marsh. "If they're watching for my name, it's not about last night's mission, it's about something else." Marsh picked up her pen, set it down. The motion of a person choosing how much to say. "Your previous assignment," she said, "the one with the classification gaps." Maya didn't answer. "I'm not asking you to tell me what it was," Marsh said. "I'm asking you to consider whether it's connected." The room was very quiet. Down the hall, someone was running a printer. The mechanical sound of it was absurd against the weight of what they were discussing. "I don't know," Maya said. It was true, she didn't know. She had suspicions that were not evidence and connections that were not confirmed, and until they were confirmed, she wasn't going to say them aloud in a room that recorded everything. Marsh studied her. "Fair enough." She closed the folder. "Go get dinner. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow morning I'm going to have a fuller picture on the communications intercept, and I'm going to want you in here at 0700. Am I restricted to base?" "No, but I'd stay close." A pause. "And Lieutenant, don't discuss this conversation with anyone." "I wasn't planning to." "I know." Marsh said it in a way that suggested she'd known that before she said it. "That's why I'm having it with you instead of someone else." The chow hall at 1900 was populated by the thin crowd of people on irregular schedules, night shift personnel, people coming off late patrols, the handful of operators who ate at odd hours because their body clocks had been broken and rebuilt enough times that the concept of mealtime had become theoretical. Maya took a tray and found a table in the corner, back to the wall, facing the room. She did this automatically, the way she did most things involving her positioning in space, not thinking about it, just doing it, the habit installed so deeply it didn't require conscious processing anymore. She ate without tasting the food. At the table nearest the coffee station, 3 men from the support unit were talking loudly about something that had happened in the vehicle pool. Normal conversation, the kind that filled rooms and meant nothing. She watched the door. Torres came in at 1920, got coffee, scanned the room, found her. He came over without being invited, which was the only way he ever came anywhere. He sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at her for a moment. "You're doing the wall thing," he said. "What wall thing?" "The thing where you put your back to the actual wall and watch every entrance. You do it every time something's bothering you." He took a sip of coffee. "You did it in the briefing tent before Black Ridge. You did it in the debrief this morning." She looked at him. "I noticed things," he said without apology. "Marsh called me back in tonight," she said. She kept her voice below the ambient noise level of the room. "She showed me something from the communications intercept." Torres's expression didn't change. He was good at that, receiving information without broadcasting his reaction to it. It was one of the things that made him easy to talk to, and also occasionally unnerving. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough that I'm telling you to be careful about what you say, and to whom for the next few days." He looked at his coffee. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I can give you right now." He accepted that with the equanimity of a man who had learned that pushing for more than what was offered usually resulted in less. "Rourke had dinner with Colonel Haskins tonight," he said. "I saw them in the officers' section when I went to return gear." Colonel Haskins was the FOB commander, a man Maya had interacted with exactly twice, both times in settings where he'd been present but not engaged with her specifically. A career officer with the particular quality of someone who had risen through a system by understanding its priorities and reflecting them back accurately. "How long?" she said. "About an hour, maybe more. They were still there when I left." She filed that. Didn't react to it in any visible way. "Get some sleep, Torres?" "Yeah." He stood up. At the edge of the table, he paused. "Maya." The first name again, twice in 2 days, which for Torres was frequency. "Whatever's happening, you're not going to try to handle it alone, right?" She looked up at him. "Not if I can help it," she said. He seemed to weigh that answer against several others she might have given and decide it was acceptable. He left. She sat alone for another 20 minutes, eating food she didn't taste, watching a door that stayed normal. At 06:52 the next morning, 8 minutes before she was due in the intelligence section, Colonel Haskins' aide found her outside the accommodation container and told her the FOB commander wanted to see her first. She stood in the thin morning cold and looked at the aide, a young captain named Feld, who had the look of a man delivering a message he hadn't been told the content of, and said, "Tell Colonel Marsh I'll be a few minutes late." "Of course, Lieutenant." She followed Feld across the compound. Us. Haskins' office was the largest interior space on the FOB, which was not saying much, but he'd made the most of it. A desk that was too big for the room, an American flag in the corner, a series of framed photographs on the wall showing him at various points in a career that appeared to have taken him to every hemisphere. He was standing when she entered, which was either a courtesy or a positioning choice. "Lieutenant Voss," he gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing. Another choice. "I've been reviewing the after action from Black Ridge," he said. "Impressive work up on that cliff." "Thank you, sir." 26 operators out, clean extraction. Commander Walker speaks very highly of your contribution. He moved behind his desk, but didn't sit. His hands rested on the back of his chair. "I want to talk about what comes next." She waited. "The protocol question," he said. "The unauthorized position change. I've read Rourke's section of the AAR, and I've read Walker's, and they tell somewhat different stories." "I imagine they do, sir." "Walker is inclined to call it initiative under fire. Rourke is inclined to call it a breach that happened to produce a good result." Haskins looked at her with the expression of a man who had managed competing versions of events for a long time. "My job is to decide which framing goes into the official record." She looked at him steadily. "With respect, sir, the framing that reflects what actually happened seems like the correct one." "Everything reflects what actually happened, Lieutenant. It's a question of emphasis." He finally sat. "Here's my concern. You're a talented operator. Your record, the parts of it I can access, is strong. But we have unit cohesion issues when junior officers make independent calls in contact situations without proper authorization, even when those calls work out. Especially when they work out," she said. He looked at her sharply. "If it works out, it sets a precedent," she said. "Other people start making unauthorized calls and referencing mine as justification. Some of those calls won't work out." She kept her voice even. "I understand the concern, sir. I'm not arguing against protocol in general. I'm saying that in a specific situation where the element leader was managing a collapsing tactical picture and the only viable firing position was one nobody had authorized because nobody had imagined it was accessible. The protocol I know, the one that says mission success and personnel safety are the primary objectives, supported what I did." Haskins looked at her for a long moment. "That's a very composed argument for 6:55 in the morning," he said. "I've been up since 5, sir." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly. Something more like recalibration. "Rourke believes you're a problem waiting to happen," he said. He said it plainly, not like he was sharing gossip, more like he was presenting a data point. "I know." "Do you know why?" She thought about that carefully. "I think Petty Officer Rourke has a specific understanding of how a unit should function and where different people fit within it, and I consistently don't fit where he expects me to." She paused. "And I think last night made that harder to manage." "Harder to manage," Haskins repeated. "That's a diplomatic way to put it." "I try to be diplomatic when I can, sir." He picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers, a thinking gesture. She'd seen it before in men who used objects to create small delays between receiving information and responding to it. I'm going to resolve the AAR framing in a way that reflects Walker's account, he said finally. Initiative under fire, justified by result. That's my ruling. He put the pen down. What I want from you is a commitment to the chain of command going forward. If you have tactical concerns, you raise them through proper channels before the operation, not during. I raised my concern about the ridgelines before the operation, sir. In the briefing. A beat. Yes, he said. You did. The pen went back to his fingers. That will also be noted in the record. She waited to see if there was more. That's all, Lieutenant. He stood, which ended the meeting as clearly as a gavel. Well done out there. Don't make me have this conversation again. No, sir. She left. In the corridor outside, she stood for a moment and breathed. The outcome of that conversation had been better than she'd walked in expecting, which meant either Haskins was genuinely committed to the accurate record or he was managing something she couldn't see yet. She didn't know which. She noted that she didn't know. Then she went to find Marsh. Emote. Marsh was not in the intelligence section. The analyst who met Maya at the door, the young one, Pemberton, who had the recent graduate look, told her that Colonel Marsh had been called to a secure communication session at 0630 and had left word that Lieutenant Voss should wait. Maya sat in the debrief room and waited. The wall screen was dark. The map was gone. The room smelled like the coffee that someone had made and not finished, and the particular staleness of a space that had been closed overnight. She waited 40 minutes. Then Marsh came in, and Maya knew immediately from the way she moved that something had changed since last night. It wasn't dramatic. Marsh wasn't a dramatic person, but there was a new quality to her stillness, the kind that appears when someone has just been given information that reorganizes other information they already had. Marsh closed the door. She didn't sit. The communications intercept has been expanded, she said. What I showed you last night was one message. The full thread is longer. She looked at Maya directly. Your name appears in 4 separate communications over the past 6 weeks. Maya looked at her. 6 weeks, she said. The earliest reference predates your attachment to this unit. Whoever flagged you knew you were going to be assigned here before the assignment was processed through standard channels. The implication of that was very specific, and Maya sat with it for a moment. That's a narrow list of people, she said. Yes. Marsh sat now. The 4th message, the most recent, sent at 0214 the morning of Black Ridge, includes a phrase the translation team has been working on. The phrase references a designation, a name. She looked at Maya with the particular quality of someone delivering information they expect to land hard. The designation is Kestrel 9. Must mean anything to you? The room temperature didn't change. Maya's face didn't change. Something moved through her that was not quite any of the available emotions. Where did you get that designation? She said. Her voice was very controlled. The intercept. That designation is classified above your access level, Colonel. Marsh looked at her. I'm aware. I'm also aware that it appeared in an enemy communication, which creates a different category of problem. A pause. The designation refers to a role, not a person, but the role is specific enough that it identifies a small enough group to stop. Maya stood up, not fast, not dramatically. She just stood. I need you to stop talking about this in a room with a recording system. Marsh looked at the ceiling, at the small device in the corner that Maya had clocked when she first entered the building 2 days ago. The recording system is offline this morning, Marsh said. I requested a maintenance cycle at 0645. It will be offline for another 20 minutes. Maya looked at her. I didn't do this carelessly, Marsh said quietly. I've been doing this job for 16 years. I know what I'm looking at. The silence between them had a different weight than previous silences. Maya was reading her, not just her words, but the small things that surrounded them. The controlled way Marsh was sitting. The fact that she'd been at a secure comms session for 40 minutes before this conversation. The fact that the recording system was conveniently offline. Either Marsh was exactly what she appeared to be, a careful, experienced intelligence officer who had stumbled onto something large and was handling it correctly, or she was something else. Maya had spent 19 months in a job that required her to make exactly this kind of assessment about people, quickly, under conditions where being wrong had permanent consequences. She made it now. Kestrel 9 was a designation used in a joint intelligence operation that ran from approximately 30 months ago to 13 months ago, she said. Her voice was flat and precise. The operation targeted a network that was running coordinated disinformation campaigns and compromised asset programs across multiple coalition partner agencies. It was classified above top secret. The number of personnel with knowledge of it is under 40. She looked at Marsh. If that designation is appearing in enemy communications now, the operation didn't end when we thought it did. It was compromised. Marsh was very still. How compromised? She said. I don't know. I left 13 months ago. I was given a standard operational conclusion briefing and reassigned. Maya looked at the wall where the map had been. But if they flagged my name 6 weeks ago, before I was even formally attached to this unit, then someone who knows about Kestrel 9 has been tracking me since before I arrived here. Someone inside the coalition structure. Yes, Marsh picked up her pen. Put it down. This time the gesture had a different quality. Not a thinking pause, but a steadying one. The network from last night, she said. The commanders you took out. The 14 months of root intelligence leaks. She looked at Maya. You think it's the same network? I think it's possible. I think the designation appearing in that intercept is not coincidental. Maya looked at her, and I think whoever sent that message at 0214 was not trying to protect an operation. They were trying to make sure I didn't come back from Black Ridge Valley. The words settled in the room like something heavy being set down on a table. Marsh absorbed it. That would mean someone with access to Kestrel 9 intelligence is actively feeding operational information to the network. Yes. And they flagged you specifically because you'd have the knowledge to recognize what they are. Yes. Another silence. Marsh looked at the desk, at the closed folder, at the space in front of her where she was organizing something in her head. I need to take this up the chain, she said. I know. That creates risk. Whoever is inside the structure will see the inquiry move. I know that too. Maya looked at her. Which channel are you going to use? Marsh looked up. Something in her expression acknowledged that Maya had just asked the right question. The question that assumed the standard channels were compromised and required her to identify one that wasn't. There's a direct reporting line to a counterintelligence office that runs outside the standard coalition structure, Marsh said. I've used it once before. It's slow and it's not comfortable to use, but it doesn't run through anyone local. Use that one, Maya said. I intend to. Marsh stood. In the meantime, you stay on base, you stay visible, and you behave like someone who doesn't know any of what we just discussed. And Rourke? Marsh looked at her. What about Rourke? Maya didn't answer. She just held the look. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then, don't do anything. I'm not planning to do anything. I mean it, Lieutenant. Whatever you're thinking, I'm not thinking anything. I'm asking you a question. Maya kept her voice even. Rourke had dinner with Haskins last night for approximately an hour. Haskins called me in this morning before I could get to you. The AAR framing question got resolved in a way that was cleaner for me than I expected. She looked at Marsh. I'm not making an accusation. I'm giving you information. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. I heard you, she said. The morning went by in the way that mornings go by when you are required to behave normally while knowing things that make normal behavior feel like a performance of itself. Maya ran maintenance on her gear. She attended a routine unit meeting that covered nothing significant. She ate lunch at the appropriate time. She spoke to the people who spoke to her with the correct amount of her usual reserve, which was enough that nobody noticed anything different. She was very good at this. She had spent 19 months being very good at exactly this. At 1400, Walker found her in the equipment room. Not the way Rourke had found her. Walker came in directly, didn't circle, didn't build to anything. You doing all right? He said. Fine, sir. Hand? Manageable. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. Walker was not someone who struggled with directness usually, which meant what he had to say was the kind of thing that directness didn't quite serve. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, it doesn't change my account of what happened on that cliff." She looked at him. "Go ahead. Have you done this before?" She held his gaze. "Done what, sir?" "That." He gestured, not at anything specific, at everything. "The cliff, the coverage, the way you moved through those positions. I've been running operators for 8 years, Voss. I know what someone who's had that training looks like, and I know what someone who's had more than that training looks like." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking for classified information. I'm asking if I should know something about you that I don't." She thought about the honest answer, and about the cost of the honest answer, and about the fact that Walker had just told her his account didn't change regardless. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am more prepared for certain situations than my current assignment reflects." He nodded once, slowly. "That's a diplomatic answer." "I'm trying to be diplomatic when I can, sir." "You said that to Haskins this morning." She looked at him. "Base is small," he said. "Word travels." He straightened up from the doorframe. "I'm going to ask Marsh to attach you to the primary planning element for the next operational cycle." She absorbed that. "Rourke won't like that," she said. "No." He almost smiled. "He won't." He turned to leave and then stopped. The same pause he'd made at the helicopter door 2 nights ago. "Voss, the gap between how you've been used in this unit and what you appear to be actually capable of, that's not an accident, is it?" She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." He nodded again, the same nod as before, like information being filed in a place it would be retrieved from. He left. Maya stood alone in the equipment room for a minute, breathing, feeling the particular sensation of things moving toward a point that she couldn't see clearly yet but could feel the shape of. Her phone, the secure unit issued by the base communications section, buzzed. A text from an internal number she didn't recognize. 4 words. "Meet me. Vehicle pool. 1600. She looked at it. Then she looked at the number. She didn't recognize it. She did recognize the format. It was a base internal code, which meant the sender was physically on FOB Kestrel. It wasn't Marsh's number, or Walker's, or Torres's. It wasn't Rourke's. She pulled up the base directory on the secure terminal and ran the number. The directory returned no result. An unregistered number, routing through the internal system, with access to her secure contact information. She thought about Marsh's instruction. Stay on base. Behave like someone who doesn't know anything. She thought about subject identified as threat to operation. She thought about 6 weeks of messages with her name in them. About Kestrel 9 and an enemy intercept. About 19 months of work that was supposed to be finished but apparently wasn't. At 15:58, she walked to the vehicle pool. Bam. The vehicle pool at 1600 was quiet. The afternoon maintenance period had ended and the evening shift hadn't started, which left the space populated by parked vehicles and the smell of diesel and the fluorescent hum of a lighting system that had been due for replacement for 2 months. She moved through the vehicle rows carefully, back to her awareness of all the entry points, which were 2. The main vehicle bay entrance she'd come through, and a side personnel door on the north wall. She was checking the north door when she heard movement behind the 3rd row of vehicles. She stopped. "Lieutenant Voss." The voice was quiet, male, middle-aged. She hadn't heard it before. She turned. The man who stepped around the front of a parked vehicle was in civilian clothes. Dark jacket, unremarkable in every way that people are unremarkable when they've spent considerable effort on it. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that didn't photograph memorably. No rank, no insignia. She didn't move toward him. "Who are you?" she said. He reached into his jacket and produced a credentials case. He held it open at a distance that required her to step closer to read it. She didn't step closer. "Read it from there, or don't read it," she said. "Your choice." Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. He took 3 steps toward her so she could see it without moving. The credentials were federal. The agency acronym was one she recognized. The name on them was Harrison. "You know what the designation Kestrel 9 means," he said. "Why are you here?" "Because the communications intercept that your Colonel Marsh found last night is the 3rd intercept in a series of 7 that my office has been tracking for 4 months. And because your name has been appearing in those intercepts since before you arrived at this FOB." He put the credentials away. "And because we have a situation that is about to become significantly worse in approximately 48 hours, and you are the only asset in this region with the background to help us address it." She looked at him. The fluorescent lights buzzed. "What situation?" she said. Harrison looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to have this particular conversation. "The network from Black Ridge Valley isn't finished," he said. "They lost their field commanders 2 nights ago, and they know exactly who took those commanders out. They're not regrouping, they're accelerating." He reached into his jacket again and produced a folded map. Not a satellite print, but a hand-drawn tactical sketch, the kind made quickly under field conditions. He held it out. "In 48 hours, there's a scheduled coalition logistics convoy moving through a route that has already been compromised. 43 personnel. The network intends to hit it in the same way they hit Black Ridge. Coordinated, pre-planned, overwhelming force." Maya took the map. She looked at the terrain sketch. The canyon system drawn on it was familiar. Not from personal experience, from study, from the regional survey work she'd done before the mission. She knew the geography. She also knew, looking at the sketch, the position that would matter most. And she knew that the person who'd drawn this sketch had also known it, because the position was marked in the same hand as the rest of the map, with a small circle and the notation V. She looked up at Harrison. "You drew this," she said. "Yes." "Before you came here?" "Yes." "Meaning you already knew what I'd look for?" She held up the map. "You already knew I'd identify this position?" "Yes." She looked at the circle, at the notation, at the position it marked, which was another cliff, different canyon, same principle. Height advantage, line of sight, coverage. "You're asking me to do this again," she said. "I'm asking you to consider it. Without authorization from my chain of command. With authorization from mine." He held her gaze. "I know what you did for 19 months, Lieutenant. I know what Kestrel 9 was and what your role in it was and what it cost you to walk away from it. I'm not asking you to go back to that." He paused. "I'm asking you to prevent 43 people from dying in a canyon in 48 hours. Maya looked at the map for a long moment. The circle. The V. The canyon she recognized. Around her, the vehicle pool hummed with fluorescent light and diesel smell, and the mundane sounds of a base continuing its ordinary business on the other side of the wall. She folded the map. She looked at Harrison. "I want to know how my name got into those intercepts," she said. "I want to know who sent the 08214 message, and I want to know what happened to Kestrel 9 after I left." "Those are fair asks," Harrison said. "They're not asks," she said. "They're the price." Harrison looked at her. Then he nodded once with the specific quality of a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected about her before he drove through the gate. "Then we have a conversation to have," he said. Harrison talked for 22 minutes. Maya listened without interrupting, which was a discipline she'd developed over 19 months of work that required you to let people finish before you told them where they were wrong. She stood with the folded map in her hand and let him talk, and she watched his hands and his eyes and the way his weight shifted when he moved from information he was comfortable delivering to information he wasn't. There was quite a bit of the second kind. Kestrel 9 had not concluded 13 months ago. That was the first thing. The operational conclusion briefing she'd received, the standard wrap-up, the sanitized summary, the paperwork that closed a chapter, had been, in Harrison's word, premature. The network Kestrel 9 had been targeting hadn't been dismantled. It had gone quiet. There was a difference, and the difference had taken the people running the operation approximately 4 months to recognize, by which point several assets had been repositioned, and one of them, a source inside the network's financial infrastructure, had stopped communicating. Stopped communicating was the language Harrison used. Maya understood what it meant. How many people knew the operation hadn't concluded? She said when he paused. At the time of your debrief, 7. He looked at her steadily. You were not one of them. I was told it was over. Yes. Why? He paused for a half-second too long. There were concerns about operational security. The network had demonstrated an ability to identify assets. The decision was made to reduce the number of people with active knowledge. She looked at him. You pulled me out because you thought I might be compromised. There was a period of assessment. You pulled me out because someone thought I might be compromised, and then it turned out I wasn't, and by the time you figured that out, I'd been reassigned and the trail had gone cold. She said it without anger. It was just a thing that had happened, and anger about things that had already happened was a resource she didn't spend freely. And now my name is in the intercepts, which means the network identified me from the Kestrel 9 work, which means they had access to information they should not have had. Yes. From inside the operation. That's our assessment. Which means the compromise you were worried about was real. It just wasn't me. Harrison looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and found that the actual version was moving faster than the rehearsed one. That's correct. She let that sit for a moment. 19 months of work, the source who'd stopped communicating, the 4 months it had taken them to recognize the difference between concluded and gone quiet. Who? She said. We don't have a confirmed identification. You have a candidate list. We have... He stopped. Started differently. We have a narrowed field. The intercepts, including the ones referencing you, have given us structural information about where the leak is positioned, but we don't have a name. Give me the structural information. Lieutenant, you came here to ask me to go into another canyon in 48 hours. You told me the price was information. She held his gaze. Give me the structural information. Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached back into his jacket. The jacket was doing a significant amount of work tonight, and produced a second folded document. He held it, but didn't hand it over yet. What I'm about to tell you cannot go into any report, cannot be discussed with your chain of command, and cannot be used to take any independent action. Those are not requests. He looked at her. Understood? Understood. He handed her the document. It was a communication diagram. Nodes and lines, the visual language of network analysis. Who talked to whom, how often, through what channels. Most of the nodes were labeled with designations rather than names, but 2 of them were circled in red ink, and one of those 2 had a secondary notation beside it, FOBK, FOB Kestrel. She studied the diagram for a moment, then she looked at the circled node and at the lines running from it, the specific pattern of which other nodes it connected to, how frequently, in what sequence. Her mind did the geometry. This node has access to operational planning, she said. Pre-mission route selection, personnel assignments, insertion timing. Yes. That's not a support function. That's a planning function. She looked at the lines again. And the communication pattern shows activity spiking in the 12 hours before each of the 4 confirmed compromised operations. Yes. The 12 hours before, not after. They weren't reporting on operations after the fact. They were flagging them in advance. She looked up. This isn't someone who accidentally gave away information. This is an active source. Yes, Harrison said. For the 3rd time in a row, which meant she was confirming rather than discovering, which meant he'd wanted her to work through it herself rather than have it handed to her. Intelligence habit. Make the asset reach the conclusion. They hold it better when they've earned it. She handed the diagram back. The dinner last night, she said. Rourke and Haskins. Harrison folded the diagram without expression. I'm not going to confirm or deny specific individuals. You don't have to. She looked at the wall of the vehicle bay, at the parking order painted on it in faded yellow letters, at the mundane infrastructure of a base that had a leak in it somewhere. The node is positioned in the planning function, on this FOB. That's a very short list. It is. And you're telling me this, but you're not telling Marsh. Colonel Marsh is conducting her own inquiry through her counterintelligence channel. We're aware of that inquiry. We're not interfering with it." He paused. "But her channel takes time, and we have 48 hours." Maya looked at him. At the unremarkable face, the civilian clothes, the jacket that held documents the way a house holds rooms. "You knew about the convoy route compromise before you came here," she said. "Yes." "How long?" 72 hours. "You've known for 72 hours that 43 people are going to drive into a prepared ambush, and you waited until now to come to this FOB. We needed to confirm several things before—" "You needed to confirm whether I was still capable of what you needed," she said. "That's why you waited for Black Ridge. You watched the outcome, and then you came here." A pause that was longer than his previous ones. "Yes," he said. She absorbed that. The particular sensation of being evaluated without knowing it, of having your performance on one operation serve as the audition for the next one. It wasn't a new sensation. She'd felt it before, in different contexts, and her relationship with it was complicated in ways she didn't have time to examine right now. "The convoy," she said. "Walk me through what you know." About what Harrison knew was thorough and deeply uncomfortable. The convoy was a mixed coalition logistics run. Fuel, medical supplies, communications equipment, scheduled to move through the Darvon Pass route in 47 hours. 43 personnel, 12 vehicles. The route had been selected 3 days ago through what was supposed to be a secure planning process. The selection was already in the network's communications, which meant the compromise had happened within hours of the decision being made. The canyon system in the terrain sketch was a choke point 17 kilometers into the pass, 3 kilometers of confined road with ridge lines on both sides, and a single bridge crossing a dried riverbed at the midpoint. Perfect geometry for an ambush. The same geometry as Black Ridge Valley, executed on a larger scale with a slower moving target. "Why not just reroute the convoy?" Maya said. "Rerouting requires explaining why, which requires acknowledging the compromise, which alerts the source that we've identified the channel." Harrison looked at her. "If the source goes quiet, we lose our ability to track the network's communications. So you're going to let 43 people drive into a kill zone to protect an intelligence channel. We're going to position an asset to neutralize the ambush before it executes." He said it without apology, which she respected more than she would have respected an apology. "The convoy doesn't know the route is compromised. They will have close air support on a 30-minute response window." 30 minutes. "The terrain limits our options." "The terrain limits your options if you're working from the ground." She looked at the sketch again, at the circle, at the V. "From the ridge system on the eastern side of that canyon, you have a full overwatch position. You can see the ambush staging before it executes. If someone can get there in time." "How much time?" "The convoy moves at 0600. An insertion would need to happen tonight." She said it flatly. "I'd need to be in position before dawn, which means inserting no later than 0100. That gives you 7 hours. It gives me 7 hours if I leave at midnight and everything goes right, which in my recent experience is not a planning assumption you build on." She looked at the map, at the terrain, at the position she was already reading the way her father had taught her to read mountains, not as obstacles, but as options. "What support?" "Minimal. The insertion has to be unacknowledged. If it goes through official channels, the source sees the movement. So no official support. I can provide a vehicle to the insertion point. Equipment you specify. Extraction is coordinated through my office directly, outside the FOB communication system." He looked at her. "It's not comfortable." "No," she said. "It's not." She stood in the fluorescent hum of the vehicle bay and looked at the sketch, and felt the weight of the next question before she asked it. "If I do this and it works," she said, "what happens to the source? The node at FOBK. The investigation continues." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." Harrison looked at her steadily. "The investigation doesn't stop because of what happens in the canyon. Those are separate tracks. They're not separate if the source has enough warning to move before the investigation closes." She folded the sketch. "I want your word that the FOBK node is under active surveillance from tonight. Not passive monitoring, active. If they try to communicate after midnight, I want that communication intercepted and acted on." Harrison was quiet for a moment. That's within my authority to arrange. Then arrange it. He nodded once. She looked at him. I'm going to need to tell Walker. Lieutenant, not the details. Not your name, not the channel, not the network assessment. She held his gaze. I need someone on this FOB who knows I'm not in my bunk tonight. If I don't come back, someone needs to know to look. Harrison considered that. Commander Walker. Yes. What will you tell him? Enough. She pocketed the folded sketch. Give me 2 hours. She found Walker at 1830 in the planning room, which was what the FOB called the large container that housed the operational mapping system and smelled like marker ink and old coffee and the particular brand of concentrated stress that accumulated in spaces where difficult decisions were made repeatedly. He was alone, looking at a regional map with the expression of a man doing calculations that weren't going his way. He looked up when she came in. At her face, then at the room behind her to confirm she'd closed the door. You have something, he said. I need to ask you something first. She stayed near the door. When you asked me today if I'd done this before, the cliff, the coverage, you said whatever the answer was, it didn't change your account. Yes. Did you mean that? He looked at her steadily. I meant it. She came to the table. She didn't lay out the sketch. She wasn't ready to do that yet. She looked at the regional map instead, at the Darvon Pass system, at the geography she'd been studying in her head for the past 90 minutes. There's a coalition logistics convoy moving through Darvon Pass at 0600 tomorrow, she said. 43 personnel. Walker looked at the map. Found the pass. His expression shifted with the specific quality of someone reading terrain and finding what they don't want to find. That route goes through the Charvon Canyon system. Yes. That's a bad road. The road is the least of the problems. She looked at him. The route selection has been compromised. The network from Black Ridge knows the convoy is coming. He was very still. How do you know that? I can't tell you how I know. I can tell you that the information is reliable and that I've had it confirmed by a source outside this FOB's chain of communication. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of long that meant he was doing several assessments simultaneously. Of the information, of her, of the implications of both. Outside this FOB's chain, he said. Yes. Meaning you're not going to tell me the source. I can't. And you're telling me this instead of Marsh because I've told Marsh what I can tell through official channels. This is a different conversation. She held his gaze. I need to be out of my bunk tonight. I need to be at a specific location by 0100. I need someone on this base to know I'm not AWOL and to know that if I'm not back by 1000 tomorrow, something has gone wrong, and that something involves the Darvon Pass convoy. Walker looked at the map, at the canyon system, at the geometry of a road that went through confined terrain with ridge lines on both sides. You're going to do what you did at Black Ridge, he said. Different canyon, same principle. Alone. Yes. Maya. He used her first name, which he hadn't done before. She noticed it the way you notice a temperature change, not dramatically, just registered. If something goes wrong up there, 43 people in a convoy find out about the ambush the hard way, and there's one fewer problem for your unit to manage. She said it without self-pity, because self-pity was an indulgence that didn't serve anything. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm asking you to know where I am. He was quiet for a long moment. What do you need from me? Don't file a report on this conversation. Don't tell Rourke. If Haskins asks where I am in the morning, tell him I'm on a Marsh-authorized intelligence task and refer him to Marsh. She looked at him. If I'm not back by 1000, tell Marsh everything I just told you. And Rourke? His voice had something careful in it when he said the name. Keep him away from the convoy communication channel tonight. Walker looked at her. She watched him work through what that implied. Not slowly. Walker was not a slow thinker, but carefully, the way you handle something that might be fragile. Is there something I should know about Rourke? He said. There's something being investigated that I'm not able to discuss. She met his eyes. I need you to trust me for the next 14 hours. He breathed out. Not a sigh, more like a man adjusting to a new weight. I've trusted you since 0341 2 days ago, he said, when someone was shooting from a cliff that wasn't supposed to be climbable. She looked at him. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a second. The gesture was old-fashioned, almost formal, the kind of thing that happened in a different era of operational culture. Then she shook it. His grip was firm and brief and said the thing that neither of them had said in words. Come back from this one too, he said. That's the plan, she said. Sir? Oh. She was outside the wire at 0047. Harrison's vehicle had left her 4 kilometers from the canyon's eastern approach. A battered civilian truck that could have belonged to any of a dozen regional logistics contractors, driven by a man who hadn't said a word for the entire 40-minute drive and had handed her a pack at the drop point without ceremony. The pack had everything she'd specified and nothing she hadn't. She'd checked it in 60 seconds before the truck drove away. The terrain between the drop point and the canyon rim was not the same as Black Ridge. It was in some ways worse and in some ways more manageable. The approach was longer, 4 kilometers of broken ground in the dark, but the final ascent to the ridge position was lower than the Black Ridge cliff, maybe 140 feet, with a more gradual angle. The rock was different too, limestone rather than the crumbling basalt she'd dealt with before, which held better under weight. She moved through the 4 kilometers in 51 minutes, which was faster than she'd planned and meant she was working with more adrenaline than was ideal for precision work. She found a position behind a rock formation at the ridge base and sat for 8 minutes, letting her heart rate come down, letting the darkness settle into something she could read. The canyon below was empty. The road was a thin, pale line in the moonlight, winding through the canyon floor like something left behind. The bridge was visible at what she estimated was the midpoint, a simple concrete structure across the dry riverbed, wide enough for a truck, old enough to have the particular texture of infrastructure that had outlasted the purpose it was built for. She scanned the ridge lines. Both sides. Methodical, starting far and working close, the way she'd been taught to clear a landscape before committing to a position. She found the first staging element at 0220, North Ridge Line, approximately 300 meters from the canyon's southern entrance. They were well concealed. She wouldn't have found them without the thermal monocular that Harrison's pack had included, and even with it they were at the edge of the device's useful range. 4 personnel, stationary, in a position that had been prepared in advance. She could see the slight regularity of the rock arrangement that indicated deliberate construction rather than natural formation. She kept scanning. Second element, South Ridge Line. 3 personnel, a heavier weapons setup. She could see the profile of a mounted weapon, probably a PKM or similar, positioned with a direct line of fire to the bridge. Third element, North Ridge Line again, further east. 2 personnel, observer post, probably coordinating the timing. She counted and calculated. It was not as large a force as Black Ridge. It didn't need to be. A convoy on a road moved slower than a SEAL element on foot, and the bridge was a natural choke point that would stop the convoy's lead vehicles while the trailing vehicles were still in the kill zone. She put the monocular away and set up her position. The limestone held. The rock formation she'd identified from the sketch was exactly where it should be, the geometry working the way she'd mapped it in her head. A natural depression that put stone behind her and on 2 sides while leaving a clean line of sight to both ridge lines and the canyon floor. She checked her watch. 247. Convoy moves at 0600. She had 3 hours and 13 minutes. She settled in the way her father had taught her to settle. Weight distributed, nothing held tense that didn't need to be held tense. Breathing slow and regular, eyes moving in patterns rather than fixing on any single point. She waited. At 0430, additional elements began moving into position. She counted them as they came, 2 more on the north ridge, 1 more on the south, a flanking element working down the western slope toward a position that would cut off any convoy vehicle that tried to reverse. By 0500, she had a full picture. 19 personnel, 1 heavy weapon, at least 3 RPG-capable positions. Command element on the north ridge, identifiable by radio activity. She could see the intermittent glow of a handset screen in the dark. She built her priority list. Command element first, then the RPG positions, specifically the ones with angles on the bridge, because if they hit the bridge, they stopped the convoy regardless of anything else she did. Then the heavy weapon, then the flanking element. She had enough ammunition. She had the position. The dawn began to show at the eastern edge of the sky. Not light yet, just the absence of the deepest dark, a gradual brightening that changed the texture of the shadows without yet resolving them into shapes. At 0542, her radio, Harrison's radio, a compact encrypted unit she'd have to return with no record of having used, carried a single transmission. Convoy is moving. On schedule. 18 minutes. She pressed her cheek against the stalk and found her breathing. Below, the canyon lay still and waiting, full of people who thought they were invisible. She thought about what Harrison had said in the vehicle bay, the only asset in this region with the background to help. She thought about what Walker had said in the planning room. I've trusted you since 0341 2 days ago. She thought about what Marsh had said about the recording system being offline. She thought about what Torres had said the first time, in the canyon, come back down. The sky lightened by degrees. At 0558, she heard the convoy, the distant diesel sound of a 12-vehicle column working through mountain roads. You could hear it before you could see it, the engine noise bouncing through the terrain. On the north ridgeline, the command element went active. The handset screen glowed steadily. A figure raised a hand, the signal passing down the ridge. They were ready. She was already ahead of them. She fired. The command element lost its commander before the convoy appeared at the canyon entrance. She moved the scope. The first RPG position went down before the operator could shoulder the weapon. The second repositioned, which was the wrong move. Repositioning exposed him to her line of sight in a way the original position hadn't. She fired again. The heavy weapon had begun to traverse toward the sound of the convoy. She could see the barrel moving, the crew working the mount. She put the first round through the weapon itself, then the second through the crew's position. The flanking element on the western slope had started moving. She tracked them for 3 seconds, establishing their direction and pace, then fired twice in rapid succession, which stopped the movement. Below, the convoy entered the canyon. The lead vehicle, a large transport truck, crossed the bridge without slowing, which meant the crew didn't know yet what was happening on the ridgelines above them. Good. Confusion was protective. Confusion kept them moving. The North Ridgeline had 3 remaining active positions. They were trying to reorganize. She could see the movement. The figures trying to find the direction of fire, looking south and east and not up, not high enough up. She worked them methodically. The South Ridgeline was nearly clear. One remaining position, an observer who had gone flat when the first shot started. She could see the shape of him against the limestone, motionless, trying to be part of the rock. She let him be part of the rock. The convoy was through the bridge, 8 vehicles across, then 10, 11. A shot came from a position she hadn't fully cleared on the north ridge. Not at the vehicles, but at the ridgeline. Someone had finally identified her general position and was responding. The shot hit 3 meters to her right and threw rock chips that she felt on her left arm like a handful of gravel thrown hard. She didn't move. She found the position the shot had come from, and she dealt with it. 12 vehicles. The convoy was through the canyon. She held the scope on the ridge lines for another 2 minutes, watching for movement. There were figures down, figures gone to ground. One figure moving in retreat along the north ridge. Running, not tactical movement, just running. She let him run. Then she put the rifle down and sat against the limestone and felt her arm, where the rock chips had hit. Not deep. She could feel the sting, but not the warmth that indicated actual bleeding. Bruising. She'd have bruising. Her radio carried Harrison's voice. Convoy is clear. All 12 vehicles. No casualties. She pressed the transmit button once. Didn't say anything. Then she began breaking down her position. She was back at FOB Kestrel at 0917. Harrison's truck dropped her at the same point it had picked her up. She walked through the wire with her pack and her rifle and her bruised arm and the weight of someone who has done a necessary thing that they are not going to be able to talk about. Torres was outside the equipment room when she came through. He looked at her, at the arm, at the pack, at the general state of her, which was dusty and worn and not quite matching the person who had gone to bed the previous night as far as the FOB's official record was concerned. "Good morning," he said. "Morning. Sleep okay?" She looked at him. "Right," he said. Stupid question. She went inside to clean the rifle and wait for whatever came next. She didn't have to wait long. At 0940, Marsh appeared in the equipment room doorway with the expression of a woman who had received several pieces of information in quick succession and was in the process of organizing them. "The counterintelligence inquiry came back," Marsh said. She came inside and closed the door. "They traced the FOBK node from the communication diagram." Maya set down the cleaning rod. "Rourke," Marsh said. The word landed in the room without drama because Maya had known it, in the way you know things that you've assembled from pieces before the final piece arrives. She'd known it since the pattern in the communication diagram, since the dinner with Haskins that Torres had observed, since the 11 months of being managed and diminished by a man who had a specific investment in her not being taken seriously. "When?" she said. "He was detained 40 minutes ago. Haskins is cooperating with the inquiry. His involvement appears to be passive. He received information from Rourke, not the other way around, and may not have understood fully what he was handling." Marsh paused. "That's the current assessment. It may change." Maya looked at the partially cleaned rifle on the table in front of her. "The Darwin Pass convoy," she said, "came through clean, all 43 personnel, no casualties." Marsh looked at her steadily. "Which is interesting because the route was compromised and the ambush was prepared and then apparently did not go the way the network planned." A pause. "I'm not going to ask you how that happened." "That's probably wise," Maya said. Marsh looked at her for a moment. The organizing expression, the 16 years of this job look. "You're going to be moved," she said, "not as a consequence of anything negative. Walker submitted a formal request this morning to have you attached to the primary planning element. I'm supporting it." She paused. "There will also be a review of your previous assignment. The classification on certain parts of your record is going to be reassessed." Maya looked at her. "By who?" "People above my level who became very interested this morning in an operation called Kestrel 9, and a lieutenant whose name kept appearing in the wrong communications for the right reasons." Marsh looked at her steadily. "You're not in trouble, Lieutenant. You're the opposite of in trouble." Maya absorbed that. She picked up the cleaning rod and went back to the rifle. "Voss?" Marsh said. She looked up. "For what it's worth." Marsh paused, and for a moment the organized professional expression dropped enough to show something more personal underneath. "I've been doing this job for 16 years. I've watched a lot of talented people get managed into corners by people who felt threatened by them." She picked up the equipment case near the door and set it down somewhere more deliberate. "It doesn't usually end this cleanly." Maya looked at her. "It's not clean," she said. "It's just not over yet." Marsh nodded once, the way people nod when they've been told a truth they already know, but needed someone else to say. Then she left. Maya finished cleaning the rifle. Outside, the base ran its ordinary business. Generators, vehicles, distant voices, the mechanical hum of infrastructure maintaining itself. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place where the emergency had happened somewhere else, and where most people still didn't know how close the somewhere else had been. She put the rifle back together. She tested the bolt. She set the rifle down and looked at her hands for a moment, at the bandaged palm, the bruised arm, the small cuts that were already beginning to close. Then she picked up the rifle again and checked the function one more time, because that was the discipline, and the discipline was what kept you alive, and she intended to stay alive. There was still work to do. The review board convened 4 days later. Not at FOB Kestrel. At a larger installation 2 hours south by aircraft, a place with actual conference rooms and actual furniture, and the particular institutional smell of a building that processed important decisions on a regular basis. Maya had been flown down the previous evening and given a room in the visitor quarters that had a window facing east and a heating system that worked without interruption, which after weeks at Kestrel felt almost disorienting. She hadn't slept well. Not because she was anxious, or not only because of that, but because her body had been running at a specific operational temperature for several days and didn't know yet that it was permitted to come down. She lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and ran through the canyon geometry again, the way she always processed completed operations, not to second-guess them, but to file them correctly, to understand what had worked and what had nearly not worked, and why. So that the next time the variables were different, she'd have the right data. There was a next time. There was always a next time. At 0600, she was up, dressed, and at the window watching the eastern light come in flat and cold over the installation's outer perimeter. She drank coffee that was better than Kestrel's, which wasn't a high bar, and she read through the documents she'd been provided. The formal review agenda, the list of attending personnel, the scope of inquiry as it had been officially described. The scope was broader than she'd expected. It covered Black Ridge Valley. It covered the Darwin Pass convoy, in language careful enough that her involvement was described only as an intelligence-sourced intervention without further specification. It covered Kestrel 9, or rather, it covered the gaps in her personnel record that Kestrel 9 had created, and the question of what those gaps represented and whether the record should be amended. And it covered Rourke. She read the section on Rourke twice. His role in the intelligence compromise had been more extensive than Marsh had indicated in the equipment room. Not just a passive conduit, but an active one, with a documented history going back 14 months. He had been providing route intelligence, personnel assignments, and operational timing to an external channel that routed through 3 intermediary nodes before reaching the network. The financial component of the arrangement was still being traced. 14 months. The same timeline as the confirmed route compromises. The same timeline, she realized, as the period during which she had been consistently placed in rear observation roles, kept out of primary planning, managed into a position where her assessments were heard last and weighted least. She sat with that for a moment. The coffee went cold while she sat with it. The conference room held 9 people when she entered at 800. She recognized 3 of them. Marsh, who had traveled down separately and was seated midway along the left side of the table with a folder in front of her, and the organized expression she seemed to carry everywhere. Walker, at the far end, in dress uniform rather than the operational clothing she'd only ever seen him in, which made him look slightly different and slightly more tired. And Harrison, in another unremarkable jacket, seated against the wall rather than at the table, which was an intelligence officer's instinctive positioning in a military setting. The remaining 6 were a combination of senior officers and 2 civilians whose agency affiliations she identified from their credentials when the board chair, a 2-star general named Alderman who had the bearing of someone who had been running these proceedings for long enough that they no longer made him uncomfortable, made the formal introductions. She was invited to sit. She sat. Alderman opened with a summary that took 4 minutes and covered the ground efficiently. He had the particular skill of describing complex situations in language that was precise without being reductive, and she found herself listening with genuine attention rather than the performative attention she usually brought to formal military proceedings. When he finished the summary, he looked at her directly. "Lieutenant Voss," he said, "I want to give you an opportunity to speak before we proceed with the board's questions. This isn't standard procedure, but given the specific circumstances, I think it's warranted." He paused. "Is there anything you'd like to say at the outset?" She looked at the table, at the 9 people arranged around and beside it, at the window behind Alderman through which the eastern light was now higher and warmer than it had been an hour ago. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had prepared something, a clear professional account of her actions and her reasoning, organized in the sequence she'd been trained to present operational decisions. She'd run through it at the window that morning. What came out was different. "I want to say that I understand why the system works the way it does," she said. Her voice was even. She wasn't performing evenness, it was just what she had. "I understand why chain of command exists and why protocol matters, and why individual operators making unilateral decisions in contact situations is a genuine problem, even when those decisions produce good results." She looked at Alderman. "I'm not here to argue that I was right to operate outside my assigned role. I'm here because the situation created a condition where operating inside my assigned role meant watching people die when I could prevent it." Alderman listened without expression. "What I do want to say," she continued, "is that the situation at Black Ridge Valley was not an accident of terrain or enemy capability. It was manufactured by a compromise that had been active for 14 months, and for a significant portion of those 14 months, I was being actively managed into a position where my ability to identify and respond to that kind of threat was limited. She paused. That's not a complaint. It's context. And I think the board should have it as context when evaluating why the decisions I made looked the way they did. The room was quiet. Alderman wrote something on his pad. Then he looked up. Thank you, Lieutenant. We'll proceed. Well, the questions lasted 3 hours. They were thorough, specific, and occasionally uncomfortable in the way that serious inquiries are uncomfortable, not because they were hostile, but because they required her to be precise about things she had processed emotionally rather than technically. The Darwin Pass operation in particular required careful navigation. She confirmed the outcome, confirmed the methodology in general terms, and declined to specify her intelligence source, which Alderman accepted with the expression of a man who had expected exactly that response and had already arranged for the relevant information to arrive through a different channel. Walker was asked about her performance at Black Ridge. He answered without consulting notes, which meant he'd been carrying the account in his head rather than on paper, which meant he'd been preparing it as something important rather than something procedural. He described the tactical situation, the timeline, the outcome. He described what she had done with the particular quality of a man who had been present for something and was trying to make sure the people who hadn't been there understood its weight. When the board asked him directly whether he believed her protocol breach was justified, he said, "I believe she kept 26 operators alive by making a decision that the protocol as written didn't account for. I also believe the protocol didn't account for it because nobody imagined the situation we were in was possible." He paused. "I'd rather update the protocol than court-martial the person who identified the gap." Nobody court-martialed anyone that day. The board recessed at 11:30 and reconvened at 1400. In the intervening time, Maya ate a meal she didn't taste in the installation's dining facility and sat alone at a corner table and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she'd developed during Kestrel 9, the ability to put her mind in neutral when it needed rest, to resist the pull toward problem-solving when there were no problems currently available to solve. Torres had texted her that morning on the secure line. 2 words. "How's it going?" She'd texted back, "Unclear. You." He'd replied, "Garrett says hi. Reyes starts PT next week." She'd put the phone away after that. At 1400, the board delivered its findings. The protocol breach at Black Ridge Valley was classified as justified action under exigent circumstances and would be noted as such in the official record rather than as a disciplinary matter. The classification gaps in her personnel record relating to the Kestrel 9 operation would be partially amended to reflect her role accurately, though specific operational details would remain classified at the appropriate level. Her attachment to the primary planning element at FOB Kestrel was approved and formalized, and a recommendation had been forwarded. The board had no authority to act on it directly, but Alderman described it with the tone of a man who expected recommendations of this type to be acted on, that her rank and role classification be reviewed for advancement. She listened to all of it with the same even attention she'd brought to the questions. When Alderman finished, he asked if she had anything to say. "One question," she said. Go ahead." "Rourke." Alderman looked at her. "Petty Officer First Class Rourke is in military custody pending a full judicial proceeding. The timeline and scope of his activity has been established. The proceeding will be conducted under appropriate authority and will not be expedited or minimized." He held her gaze. "It will be handled." She nodded. "Thank you, sir," she said. Walker found her afterward in the corridor outside the conference room. He wasn't in a hurry. He walked with her toward the exit at a pace that suggested he had something to say and was deciding how to say it, which was unlike him. Walker usually knew how to say things. "The board called it justified action," he said. "Yes, that's the right call." "I think so." They walked a few more steps. Outside, through the glass doors at the end of the corridor, she could see the installation's parade ground and the afternoon light sitting flat on it. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "Not for Black Ridge, for before it." He kept his eyes forward. "I ran that briefing. I heard your concern about the ridgelines, and I moved on. I'd heard concerns from other people in other briefings, and most of them were wrong, and I applied that history to your concern without—" He stopped, started again. "Without giving it the weight it deserved. That's on me." She was quiet for a moment. "You couldn't have known. I could have listened better." He said it simply, without excessive weight, the way people say true things they've arrived at through honest accounting rather than guilt. "I'm going to try to do that going forward." She looked at him. At the profile of a man who had just said something it cost him something to say. "Okay," she said. Not, "it's fine," and not, "I forgive you," and not any of the social formulas that would have let him off the hook without the exchange meaning anything. Just, "Okay, received, noted. We continue." He nodded. At the glass doors, they stopped. "The primary planning element is going to be different with you in it," he said. "Rourke ran a lot of the pre-mission assessment process. There's going to be a gap." "I know. I'm going to need someone who can—" "I know," she said. "I'll be there." He looked at her for a moment. "Good." He pushed through the doors and walked out onto the parade ground, and she watched him go, and then she followed. Marsh was waiting near the vehicle that would take them back to the airfield. She was looking at her phone with the focused expression of a woman managing several things at once, and she looked up when Maya approached. "Harrison is gone," she said. "He left this morning. I don't expect to see him again." "No," Maya said. "Neither do I." "He left something for you." Marsh held out a folded note. Maya took it and opened it. 4 words in Harrison's precise handwriting. "The network is not finished." She looked at it for a moment, then she folded it and put it in her breast pocket and didn't say anything. Marsh watched her do this. "Anything I should know?" "Probably," Maya said. "When the time comes." Marsh accepted that with the equanimity of a woman who had been receiving partial information for 16 years and had learned to work with what was available. "The installation here has decent physical training facilities," Marsh said, with the complete non sequitur of a woman changing subjects deliberately. "If you want to use them before we fly back." "How long do we have?" "Couple hours." Maya thought about it. Her arm still ached where the rock chips had hit it. Her palm was still healing under the bandage. Her legs carried the particular deep fatigue of 2 nights of mountain terrain under load. "Yeah," she said, "I'll use them." She ran for 45 minutes on a treadmill in the installation gym, which was not how she preferred to run, but which was what was available. The gym was nearly empty at that hour. A couple of personnel she didn't know, doing their own things, paying her no attention. She ran without music. She ran without thinking about anything specific, letting her mind do what it did when she gave it space. Sort through things, file things, discard what didn't need to be carried forward. She thought about Rourke in military custody, about 14 months of manufactured insignificance, of being kept small by someone who had a specific investment in her not being seen. She didn't feel triumph about his arrest. She felt something more complicated, the specific exhaustion of having carried something for a long time and then put it down, and realizing only after putting it down how heavy it had been. She thought about her father, about the mountains outside Juneau, about the thing he'd said when she was 12, standing at the base of a wall that looked impossible. The wall doesn't care about your doubt. It only responds to your hands. She ran. At the 30-minute mark, a man got on the treadmill 2 down from her. Early 30s, fit, dark hair, wearing the unremarkable athletic clothing of someone who worked out regularly without making it a statement. He ran without looking at her. After 3 minutes, he said, without turning his head, "You're the one from Black Ridge." She kept running. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No," he said. "Of course not." They ran in silence for another 5 minutes. "I was on the convoy," he said. "Darvan Pass." She looked at the treadmill display in front of her. 43 people, she said. "You'd have to narrow it down." "I was in Vehicle 7, midpoint of the column." He paused. "We heard shots on the ridgelines. By the time we understood what was happening, we were already through the canyon." She kept her pace steady. "The official report says it was an air asset," he said. "Then that's what it was." He ran for another few seconds. Right, he said quietly. Thank you. She looked straight ahead. Don't thank something that didn't happen, she said. He got off the treadmill at the 38-minute mark and left without looking back at her. She ran the remaining 7 minutes and thought about nothing at all. The flight back to Kestrel took 40 minutes. She sat by the window again, same position as the flight down 2 nights before, and watched the mountains pass beneath the aircraft in the late afternoon light. The particular red-gold quality that the angle of the sun produced in this part of the world, which turned the stone warm and made the shadows long and gave the terrain a beauty that had nothing to do with whether or not it was trying to kill you. Marsh was across the aisle reading. Walker was toward the front, talking quietly with one of the board's staff officers about something logistical. Maya looked at the mountains. She thought about the note in her breast pocket. The network is not finished. She knew it wasn't. She'd known it since the vehicle bay, since Harrison had shown her the communication diagram, since she'd understood that what Kestrel 9 had targeted was not an organization you could dismantle by removing its field commanders. The people who built it had built it to survive exactly the kind of pressure that had been applied to it. The commanders she'd neutralized at Black Ridge, the ambush she'd disrupted at Darvon Pass, those were not the network's core. They were operational elements, expendable from the perspective of whoever sat at the center of it. She didn't know yet what came next. She did know that she would be better positioned to face it than she'd been a week ago. She had Walker's trust now, real trust, earned, not the polite professional acknowledgement that passed for trust in units where people didn't actually know each other. She had Marsh's access and Marsh's intelligence channel. She had Harrison's number, even if using it would require a specific kind of situation to justify it. And she had something she hadn't entirely had before, a record that, for the first time, was starting to accurately reflect who she was. That mattered. Not for pride. Not for recognition in the way that people meant recognition when they used it as a reward. It mattered because the work ahead was going to require her to be trusted in rooms where trust was allocated based on record, and a record with gaps in it was a record that people worked around rather than through. She was done being worked around. FOB Kestrel looked different when they landed. It was the same collection of prefabricated structures and HESCO barriers and wine-scoured pavement. The same cold, the same bad coffee that she could smell from the vehicle that met them at the airfield. But it was different in the way that familiar places become different after you've been changed by something that happened while you were away from them. The change is in you, not the place, but the place reflects it back differently, and that's close enough. Torres was at the vehicle pool when she walked through with her pack. He didn't say anything immediately. He walked beside her for 30 meters in the comfortable silence of someone who didn't need to fill space. Then, "Board went okay? Well enough?" "Marsh told me about the planning element." "Did she?" "She told me you'd be leading pre-mission terrain assessment going forward." He paused. "Which I'm pretty sure is a new role that didn't exist before she invented it this morning." Maya looked at him. "She's adjusting the process," Torres said, "using what happened to make the argument that terrain assessment needs a dedicated function with actual authority in the planning cycle." He paused again. "She used your name when she made the argument." Maya thought about that, about Marsh in her office 16 years in, processing information and building structures for the future out of it, about the particular kind of competence that didn't make noise but made things. "Good," she said. They reached the equipment room and she stopped at the door. "Reyes starts PT next week," Torres said. "You told me." "I know, I'm telling you again because he also said—" He stopped, started differently. "He asked me to tell you that he looked up the Black Ridge report. Your name in it." He looked at her. "He said he's sorry it took him that long to learn it." She looked at him for a moment. "He doesn't owe me anything," she said. "I know, he knows that too." Torres held her gaze. He wanted to say it anyway. She looked at the door. At the equipment room beyond it, the cleaning mat, the rifle case, the familiar smell of solvent and metal. "Tell him I said he better be able to run a mile by the end of the month," she said. Torres almost smiled. The almost smile she'd come to understand was the full version for him. "I'll pass that along." She went inside, but that night she sat outside her accommodation container for a while after the base had gone to its late evening quiet. The wind had died down for once. or not died exactly, but pulled back to something that was bearable rather than aggressive, and the sky above the HESCO perimeter was clear enough to show stars in the gaps between the installation lighting. She had the folded note in her hand. The network is not finished. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket. She was not finished either. That was the thing about the kind of work she did. It didn't end cleanly, the way stories were supposed to end. The network was out there. The gaps in what was known were larger than the things that were known. Somewhere at the center of a structure she'd only seen the edges of, someone had put her name in a communication and called her a threat. They were right. She was a threat. She had been since the first day she'd looked at a mountain and seen a route instead of an obstacle. Since the first time she'd sat in the back of a briefing tent and seen the terrain problem that the louder voices in the room were missing. Since Black Ridge Valley. Since the cliff face. Since she'd put the crosshairs on a target and understood that the work of protecting people was not glamorous and was not clean and was often invisible and was worth doing anyway. She was a threat to the things that needed to be threatened. And she was still here. She leaned back against the container wall and looked at the stars and breathed the cold air and let herself be still for a little while. Not idle, not empty, just still. The way her father had taught her to be still on the mountain when the conditions weren't right yet. Patient, ready, present in the moment before the moment arrived. Somewhere across the installation, a generator cycled down for the night, and the ambient hum shifted to a lower register. She closed her eyes. She thought about the cliff, about the moment at 200 feet when the hold gave way and she swung out on one hand and looked down at the canyon floor and chose not to fall. Not because she wasn't afraid, because there was someone below who needed what only she could reach from where she was. That was the whole of it, really. Strip away the record reviews and the board findings and the protocol questions and the intelligence channels and all the architecture of the institution. Strip all of it away, and what you had was one person who could see the route everyone else had written off and who climbed it anyway. She opened her eyes. The stars were still there. She got up, went inside, and slept without interruption for the first time in a week. 3 weeks later, she stood at the head of a planning table for the first time. Not in the back row. Not in the folding chair wedged against the support strut. At the table, with the terrain map in front of her, with 8 operators seated around her who had been briefed that the new terrain assessment lead would be running this portion of the pre-mission planning cycle. She looked at the map. She looked at the room. She began. Some people are kept in the back of the room for a long time, not because they don't belong at the front, but because the people at the front are afraid of what happens when they get there. If this story stayed with you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. And don't let anyone convince you that the wall is impassable. It never was.